Ma'am, that's not real medicine. You can't bring street drugs on this plane. Flight attendant Veronica Ellis snatched the inhaler from 17-year-old Zoe Jackson's trembling hands. The cabin fell silent. United Airways Flight 829 sat at JFK's gate, passengers already buckled in for the cross-country journey to Los Angeles. Zoe's dark eyes filled with tears as she clutched her chest, breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the aircraft's humming engines. "I can't breathe without it." Veronica held the inhaler up like evidence in a courtroom. "Next, you'll tell me this candy is chemotherapy." Her voice carried across the first-class section, where passengers shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats. Some pulled out phones. Zoe's medical ID bracelet caught the overhead light as she reached desperately toward her confiscated medication. Have you ever watched someone's life hang in the balance while others stood by filming instead of helping? Veronica Ellis had worked for United Airways for 12 years. She prided herself on maintaining order following protocol, keeping passengers safe. But as she stared at the teenager in seat 23F, something else entirely drove her actions. Zoe Jackson didn't fit Veronica's image of a typical first-class passenger. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes came from thrift stores, not designer boutiques. When Zoe had initially tried to sit in seat 2A, Veronica had immediately assumed she was in the wrong place. "Where did you even get this?" Veronica waved the inhaler again. "Your dealer." The accusation hung in the recycled air. Zoe's breathing grew more labored with each passing second. She pointed to her medical ID bracelet with shaking fingers. "That's fake jewelry," Veronica dismissed, not even glancing at the engraved medical information. "I've seen it all before. In row 15, passenger Isabella Rodriguez was going live on Instagram. At Travel with Isabella here, and y'all need to see this discrimination happening right now on United 829, she narrated quietly. Her phone captured every word, every gesture, every moment of Zoe's humiliation. Zoe tried to explain through increasingly difficult breaths. "I'm Zoe Jackson. I'm 17. I have severe asthma. I'm traveling alone to my grandmother's funeral in Los Angeles." "Save the sob story," Veronica snapped. She glanced at her watch. 10 minutes until scheduled departure. The gate agents were preparing to close the aircraft door. Zoe's phone buzzed insistently in her lap. The caller ID read Dad, but she was too focused on trying to breathe to answer. Her carry-on bag sat in the overhead compartment containing her MIT early admission letter and expensive electronics that didn't match Veronica's assumptions about her background. "Either this medicine goes in the trash," Veronica announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "or you get off my plane." The ultimatum sent murmurs through the cabin. A few passengers in coach craned their necks to see what was happening. The first-class section had gone completely quiet, except for the soft sound of phones recording. Zoe's chest rose and fell rapidly. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. The signs of an impending asthma attack were unmistakable to anyone with medical training. But Veronica saw only what she expected to see. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Zoe whispered the words barely escaping her constricted airways. Veronica laughed coldly. "Right, I'm sure your people will be calling their lawyers." The racist undertone wasn't lost on anyone listening. Isabella's live stream had already gained 500 viewers in the first few minutes. Comments were pouring in, most expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Zoe's boarding pass lay crumpled in her lap. If Veronica had looked closely, she would have noticed something odd. The pass showed seat 2A in first class, but Zoe sat in 23F in coach. How had she ended up in the wrong section? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight attendants prepare for departure. We're number 3 for pushback." Time was running out. Zoe's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her wheezing had become audible to passengers 3 rows away. The elderly gentleman in 20C who'd identified himself as a retired doctor during boarding started to rise from his seat. "Stay seated," Sir Veronica commanded. "This is a crew matter." But Zoe's phone kept buzzing. The missed calls were piling up, all from the same contact. Her father was trying to reach her, but she was too focused on the burning sensation in her chest to notice. Veronica held the inhaler higher, as if making a point to the entire cabin. "I don't know what kind of operation you think you're running, but this is a respectable airline." From behind Veronica, another flight attendant named Thomas Walsh nodded in agreement. "We have protocols for a reason," he added, reinforcing his colleague's position. "If it's not properly documented, we can't allow it." Zoe's response was cut short by a coughing fit that left her gasping. Her lips were beginning to show the faintest blue tinge. The aircraft door remained open, but Veronica's ultimatum hung in the air. The other flight attendants watched nervously from their positions, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge their senior colleague's authority. Isabella's live stream had hit 10,000 viewers. Let Zoe Breathe was beginning to trend. Major news outlets were starting to pick up the story, but Veronica remained oblivious to the storm building around her actions. Zoe fumbled for her phone as another wave of breathing difficulty hit her. Her father's number appeared on the screen again. This time she knew she had to answer. Zoe Jackson had never wanted to be the center of attention. Growing up in Baltimore with a single father who worked long hours as an airline pilot, she'd learned early to be self-sufficient, responsible, and most of all prepared. Her asthma had been part of her life since she was 4 years old, a constant companion that had taught her to carry her inhaler everywhere and to stay calm when her lungs betrayed her. But today, for the first time, someone had taken that lifeline away. 3 days ago, Zoe had received the letter that would change her life. Early acceptance to MIT with a full scholarship in biomedical engineering. Her grandmother, Eliza Jackson, had been the first to receive the call from Zoe. "Grandma." "I got in," she had exclaimed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I'm going to create medical devices that help people like me." The next morning, Eliza had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The joy of achievement and the pain of loss had collided in Zoe's young life within 24 hours. Now, as she sat on United Airways Flight 829, Zoe was traveling to say goodbye to the woman who had helped raise her, who had sat by her hospital bed during her worst asthma attacks, who had taught her that her brilliance mattered more than her appearance. Grandma Eliza had always said, "Baby girl, the world won't always see your worth at first glance." But that doesn't diminish it one bit. Those words echoed in Zoe's mind as the flight attendant looked at her like she was somehow unworthy of being there. It wasn't the first time. Last year at a science competition in Boston, a security guard had followed her around the convention center, asking repeatedly to see her participant badge. 3 months ago at a college recruitment event, another student's parent had asked if she was there to serve refreshments. Each time Zoe had maintained her dignity, had proved herself through excellence rather than anger. But today was different. Today she couldn't breathe, and the weight of grief over her grandmother made the indignity harder to bear. Her father had insisted on booking her a first-class ticket for the cross-country flight, knowing her asthma often worsened during travel. "You deserve comfort on this difficult journey," he had said. But when she'd tried to take her assigned seat in 2A, Veronica had immediately redirected her. There must be some mistake, Veronica had said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Coach boarding isn't for another 20 minutes. Zoe had shown her boarding pass, but Veronica insisted there was a system error and escorted her to an empty seat in coach while she sorted it out. That was 30 minutes ago, and Veronica had never returned with an explanation. Now, as her chest tightened and her breathing became more labored, Zoe felt a familiar fear rising. She'd been hospitalized 3 times for severe asthma attacks, and she recognized the warning signs. Without her inhaler, she had perhaps 15 minutes before her airways constricted to the point where emergency intervention would be necessary. The blue-tinged lips, the dizziness beginning to cloud her vision, the burning in her chest. These were not just discomforts, they were danger signals. Through the fog of oxygen deprivation, Zoe thought of her father. Captain Marcus Jackson would know what to do. He always did. But he was supposed to be flying a different route today, unable to see her off at the airport. The buzzing phone in her lap seemed like a lifeline from another world, one where she could breathe freely, where she was respected, where her grandmother was still alive. Zoe also thought of her mother, Dr. Amara Jackson, who had died when Zoe was just 8 years old. A brilliant pulmonologist specializing in respiratory diseases, her mother had been the one to first recognize Zoe's asthma symptoms and ensure she received proper treatment. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Her mother had spent her life helping people breathe, and now Zoe was fighting for breath while a stranger held her medication hostage. As another coughing spasm seized her, Zoe noticed something through her tears. The passengers around her weren't just uncomfortable spectators anymore. They were becoming witnesses, and some were becoming advocates. An older man was arguing with Veronica. A woman was filming. Someone had pressed the call button 3 rows ahead. In that moment, despite her fear, Zoe felt a strange clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been misjudged, dismissed, or endangered because of someone else's prejudice. With trembling fingers, she reached again for her phone. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Veronica Ellis hadn't always been this person. 12 years ago, when she first pinned on her United Airways wings, she'd been filled with excitement about a career that would take her around the world. She'd loved the crisp blue uniform, the respectful nods from passengers, the sense that she was part of something elegant and important. Back then, her smile had been genuine, her desire to help passengers authentic. That was before the industry changed, before the cutbacks, the fuller flights, the increased responsibilities with decreased support. Before her husband Michael left, taking half their savings and leaving her with a mortgage she could barely afford on a flight attendant's salary. Before her mother's long illness drained what little financial cushion remained. Before she turned 45 and realized that her dreams of advancement within the airline had stalled, leaving her in the same position she'd started in, just older and more bitter. This morning had been particularly difficult. Her hot water heater had failed, leaving her with an ice-cold shower. The subway was delayed. Her request for Christmas week off had been denied for the 3rd year in a row. By the time she arrived at JFK for Flight 829 to Los Angeles, Veronica was already running on empty, her patience worn to a dangerous thinness. Then came the girl, walking confidently toward first class in her worn jeans and simple white t-shirt. No designer luggage, no expensive watch or jewelry, just that casual entitlement that made Veronica's blood boil. When the girl had presented her boarding pass for seat 2A, Veronica had been certain it was fraudulent. People tried to scam upgrades all the time. She'd escorted the girl to coach, promising to verify her ticket, then conveniently forgotten to follow up. One small victory in a day full of defeats. But now the situation was escalating. The girl claimed to need medicine, an inhaler that looked suspiciously like the type of device drug users modified for illegal substances. Veronica had seen a documentary about it just last month. And the girl's insistence, her suggestion that Veronica was somehow mistreating her, triggered something deep and defensive. "I'm in control here," Veronica thought, gripping the inhaler tighter. "This is my aircraft, my domain." The sense of power was intoxicating, a feeling of authority that had been lacking in every other area of her life. Here, at least, passengers had to listen to her. Here she made the rules. There was also another factor driving Veronica's actions, one she rarely acknowledged even to herself. 6 years ago, she had been working a flight to Miami when a young man had suffered a seizure. He had claimed to need medication from his carry-on, but Veronica, suspecting drug use, had delayed access. The man had been hospitalized upon landing. Though the airline had eventually cleared her of wrongdoing, The incident had left her hypervigilant about passengers claiming medical needs without proper documentation. Her instinct now was always to err on the side of suspicion rather than compassion, a defensive posture that protected her from repeating what she saw as a professional embarrassment. In her 12 years of flying, Veronica had developed what she considered an infallible sense for trouble. Young people traveling alone, passengers who didn't match their seating assignment, anyone who questioned her authority. These were red flags that she prided herself on identifying. The fact that these instincts often led her to scrutinize passengers of color more closely was something she refused to acknowledge even to herself. The growing discomfort of the passengers around her barely registered. In Veronica's mind, she was performing her duty, protecting the flight from potential drug use, maintaining order. The girl's increasing respiratory distress seemed like theater, an attempt to gain sympathy and avoid consequences. The medical ID bracelet, probably purchased online like the fake IDs kids used to buy alcohol. "I've been doing this too long to be fooled," she thought, even as a small voice of doubt began to whisper at the edges of her consciousness. What if the girl really was sick? What if the inhaler was legitimate? What if she was making a terrible mistake? Veronica pushed those thoughts away. Admitting error now would undermine her authority, would suggest weakness. Better to stand firm. The girl would be fine. Dramatics, nothing more. And if there was actually a problem, there were doctors at the airport. It wasn't Veronica's responsibility to distinguish between genuine medical needs and elaborate teenage deceptions. Behind her practiced mask of professional detachment, Veronica felt a flicker of satisfaction. Let the girl learn that actions have consequences. Let her learn that the world doesn't bend to accommodate everyone's claims and demands. It certainly hadn't bent for Veronica. As she held the inhaler aloft like a trophy, Veronica didn't notice the growing number of phone cameras pointed in her direction. She didn't see the silent exchanges between passengers or recognize the shift in atmosphere that signaled trouble brewing. In her single-minded focus on control, she was missing the warning signs that her world was about to collapse around her. The call from the cockpit came at the worst possible moment. "Veronica." "What's the delay?" "We're cleared for pushback." Her supervisor, Sophia Martinez, appeared at the front of the coach section, brows furrowed in concern. "Handling a situation with contraband." Veronica replied crisply, gesturing toward Zoe, who was now hunched forward in her seat, both hands pressing against her chest. Sophia approached cautiously, taking in the scene. The confiscated inhaler, the visibly struggling teenager, the uncomfortable passengers, many now openly recording the incident. "What kind of contraband?" Sophia asked, her voice low. "Unverified medication, possibly modified for drug use." Veronica maintained her position of authority, but something in Sophia's expression made her straighten her uniform jacket defensively. "Did you check her medical documentation?" Sophia's question was simple but pointed. Veronica gestured dismissively toward Zoe's wrist. "She has some bracelet claims it's medical ID. Probably fake." Flight attendant Thomas Walsh moved closer, aligning himself with Veronica. "I've seen these scams before," he said with unearned confidence. "Kids trying to bring vape cartridges aboard disguised as medical devices. Remember that incident on the Denver flight last month?" His support bolstered Veronica's resolve, even as several passengers began to shake their heads in disbelief at the escalating situation. Sophia stepped closer to Zoe, genuine concern replacing professional detachment. "Miss, can I see your medical ID, please?" Zoe extended her wrist with trembling hands. The silver bracelet caught the light, its engraving clearly visible. "Zoe Jackson, severe asthma, albuterol required." Sophia's face changed instantly. "Veronica, this is a legitimate medical alert bracelet. You can buy those anywhere," Veronica insisted, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Thomas nodded in agreement. Could be ordered online. Doesn't prove anything. By now, Zoe's breathing had become alarmingly labored. The wheezing sound was audible several rows away. Her chest muscles were working visibly harder with each breath pulling in at the spaces between her ribs as she struggled for air. Her lips had progressed from faintly blue to a more pronounced cyan color. Dr. Rafael Hernandez in row 20C could remain silent no longer. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of decades in medicine. "That young lady is having a severe asthma attack. As a physician, I can tell you she needs her medication immediately." Veronica turned, irritation flashing across her face. "Sir, please remain seated. We're handling this." "You're not handling a situation," Dr. Hernandez replied firmly. "You're creating a medical emergency." An older businessman in first class called out, "Just give her the medicine. Who cares if it's properly documented?" But another passenger nearby countered, "They have protocols for a reason. They can't just let anyone take anything they want on a plane." The tension in the cabin ratcheted higher. Isabella Rodriguez's live stream had now reached 25,000 viewers, with comments flooding in so fast they blurred on the screen. "Let Zoe Breathe" had begun trending nationally within minutes. A young man 3 rows ahead of Zoe stood up. "Give her back the inhaler. Can't you see she can't breathe?" "Sir, sit down immediately," Veronica ordered, but her command lacked its earlier confidence. Sophia placed a hand on Veronica's arm. "I think we should return the medication while we verify I've made my decision," Veronica hissed, pulling away. "Either she leaves the aircraft with this contraband, or it stays confiscated until we can have it properly examined." Thomas stood firmly beside Veronica. "We need to be consistent with policy. If we make exceptions, where does it end?" Zoe's phone continued buzzing. The screen displayed Dad and a photo of a man in a United Airways captain's uniform. Through her oxygen-deprived haze, Zoe made a decision. With shaking fingers, she answered the call. "Dad." She wheezed, her voice barely audible. "Can't breathe. They took my inhaler." The voice that responded was crisp, authoritative, and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Who took your inhaler?" "Zoe. Put them on the phone now." With trembling hands, Zoe extended the phone toward Veronica. "My father wants to speak with you." Veronica hesitated, then took the phone with reluctant fingers. "This is Flight Attendant Ellis. We're managing a situation with your daughter's unverified." She stopped abruptly, the color draining from her face as the voice on the other end spoke. Around her, the cabin had gone completely silent, passengers straining to hear the one-sided conversation. Even Sophia leaned closer, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "Yes, sir," Veronica stammered. "I understand, but protocols require." She fell silent again, listening. Her hand began to tremble. She didn't explain. "I wasn't aware." Another pause. "You're where the final question seemed to hang in the air." Isabella zoomed in with her camera, capturing the moment Veronica's professional facade cracked completely. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, sensing that something significant had changed. Veronica lowered the phone slowly, her face ashen. Without a word, she handed the inhaler back to Zoe, who immediately brought it to her lips and triggered a life-saving dose of medicine. The relief wasn't instant, but the medication began to open her airways, easing the crushing pressure in her chest. "What did he say?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Veronica didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, frozen in place like a statue as the enormity of her mistake began to dawn on her. In the silence that followed, Zoe's phone slipped from Veronica's fingers back into the teenager's lap. The call still connected. 2 TSA officers appeared at the aircraft door, responding to Veronica's earlier request to remove a passenger with contraband. They surveyed the scene with professional caution, noting the numerous passengers recording the teenager using an inhaler and the strangely immobile flight attendant. "We were called about an issue with prohibited items," the lead officer inquired. Before Veronica could respond, the aircraft door opened wider, and a commanding figure appeared in the entryway. Captain Marcus Jackson, in full United Airways uniform with 4 gold stripes on his sleeves, stepped into the cabin. His eyes scanned the scene with military precision until they locked on his daughter. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly from tension to electric anticipation. Whatever happened next would not be resolved quietly. Dr. Rafael Hernandez had seen death too many times to mistake its approach. For 40 years he had battled against it in emergency rooms in field hospitals during his military service and in his pulmonology practice before retirement. The blue tinge on Zoe Jackson's lips sent alarm bells ringing in his mind the moment he noticed it from his seat in 20C. At 65, with silver hair and deeply etched smile lines, Dr. Hernandez carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had saved countless lives. His eyes, sharp behind rectangular glasses, missed nothing. Not the girl's labored breathing, not her hunched posture as she tried to draw oxygen into failing lungs, and certainly not the callous dismissal from the flight attendant who held her medication hostage. 23 years ago, his own son, Miguel, had nearly died from an asthma attack at a school where a teacher had refused to believe the severity of his condition. The memory of his 7-year-old boy, lips blue and eyes wide with terror, had never left him. He had arrived at the school to find Miguel being treated by paramedics, the teacher still insisting the boy had been making a fuss about nothing. That day had changed Dr. Hernandez, transforming him from merely a physician into an advocate. When he first noticed the confrontation between Zoe and the flight attendant, he had observed carefully, assessing whether intervention was necessary. But when he saw the inhaler being confiscated, when he heard the dismissive tone, when he noticed the progressive cyanosis in the girl's lips, medical training overrode social convention. "Excuse me." He had called out, his voice carrying the weight of decades of medical authority. When Veronica dismissed him, he felt a familiar anger rising. The same righteous indignation he had felt standing in that school hallway while his son fought for breath. "This is not a matter of airline protocol," he said, rising from his seat despite Veronica's command to remain seated. "This is a medical emergency. That young woman is experiencing a severe asthma attack. Without her rescue medication, she risks not getting enough oxygen to her vital organs, which could lead to serious complications." He deliberately simplified his language, avoiding the technical terms he would use with colleagues. Years of explaining medical conditions to patients had taught him that clear communication was often more effective than clinical precision in emergency situations. The medical terminology flowed automatically, his professional training taking over, but the flight attendant's continued dismissal awakened something more personal. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped into the aisle. "Ma'am, I am Dr. Rafael Hernandez, former chief of pulmonology at Mount Sinai Hospital. I recognize the signs of severe respiratory distress, and this young woman needs her medication immediately." Several passengers nodded in agreement, their phones recording his intervention. He was not a man who sought attention, but in this moment he welcomed the documentation. Too often these incidents happened without witnesses, without accountability. "Sir, return to your seat or you'll be removed from this flight," Veronica threatened, though her voice lacked conviction. "I took an oath to do no harm," Dr. Hernandez replied calmly. Remaining silent while watching a young person suffer constitutes harm by omission. I cannot and will not comply with that request. He moved forward, approaching Zoe's row. He noted her rapid, shallow breathing, at least 30 respirations per minute. He saw the spaces between her ribs sinking in with each breath as her chest muscles worked overtime. Her pulse, visible at her neck, was racing. "Young lady," he said gently, kneeling beside her seat despite his arthritic knees. "I'm a doctor. On a scale of 1 to 10, how severe is your breathing difficulty?" Zoe held up 8 fingers, unable to speak. Dr. Hernandez nodded, understanding perfectly. "This is a medical emergency," he announced, turning to address the cabin at large. This passenger requires her prescribed medication immediately and possibly emergency medical services if her condition deteriorates further. The authority in his voice created a ripple effect through the cabin. Passengers who had been uncomfortably silent began to murmur in support. A woman across the aisle offered a bottle of water. A young man in the row ahead turned fully around, glaring at Veronica. "You're going to let her die to prove a point," the young man demanded. Not everyone was convinced, however. An older businessman in a tailored suit shook his head. "The airline has procedures for a reason," he said loudly. "We can't have people taking unknown substances on planes these days." Dr. Hernandez placed a reassuring hand on Zoe's shoulder. "You won't die today," he promised her quietly. "Not while I'm here." Then, raising his voice to address Veronica, "I am formally advising you as a medical professional that withholding this passenger's prescribed medication constitutes negligence and could result in serious harm. If you continue to withhold treatment, I will personally ensure that your decision and its consequences are documented in detail for the relevant authorities." The threat was not idle. Throughout his career, Dr. Hernandez had served as an expert witness in dozens of medical negligence cases. He understood the legal implications of Veronica's actions better than she possibly could. When Zoe managed to retrieve her phone and call her father, Dr. Hernandez watched carefully, ready to provide medical assistance the moment the inhaler was returned. The shift in Veronica's demeanor as she spoke to Zoe's father was dramatic. Whatever was said had clearly shaken her to her core. As Captain Marcus Jackson appeared at the aircraft door minutes later, Dr. Hernandez felt a surge of relief. The cavalry had arrived, but his job wasn't finished. He would stay with his patient until she was stable, would provide a medical assessment if needed, and would ensure that this incident wasn't simply brushed aside as a misunderstanding. Too many lives had been lost to prejudice masquerading as protocol. Not today. Not on his watch. Isabella Rodriguez had not planned to become part of a viral news story when she boarded United Airways Flight 829 that morning. At 32, the independent journalist specialized in civil rights issues and social justice reporting, but today was supposed to be a personal trip, visiting her sister in Los Angeles for a long overdue vacation. The expensive camera equipment in her carry-on was meant for capturing sunset views from her sister's Malibu apartment, not documenting discrimination at 30,000 feet. But the moment she heard Veronica Ellis's tone while addressing Zoe Jackson, something shifted in Isabella's mind. The professional observer in her recognized the familiar patterns. The automatic suspicion, the dismissal of medical concerns, the thinly veiled contempt in phrases like, "your people." She had documented similar interactions dozens of times in her career, from housing discrimination to police encounters. With practiced discretion, Isabella retrieved her phone and activated her professional live streaming setup. She had invested in high-quality mobile equipment precisely because news didn't wait for convenient moments. The phone attachment provided stabilization. The directional microphone captured clear audio even in the noisy cabin, and her positioning gave her an unobstructed view of the confrontation. "At travel with Isabella here," she narrated quietly into her microphone, knowing that her 50,000 followers would start receiving notifications immediately. "I'm witnessing what appears to be medical discrimination happening right now on United 829 at JFK. A flight attendant has confiscated what a young black passenger claims is her asthma inhaler, accusing her of carrying drugs." Isabella was careful to present the facts without embellishment. Her journalism professors had drilled into her the importance of accuracy, especially when broadcasting live. "Document, don't dramatize," had been her mentor's constant refrain. As the situation escalated, Isabella maintained her professional composure, but her heart raced with familiar anger. Born to Puerto Rican parents in the Bronx, she had experienced her share of prejudice and had channeled that experience into her work. Her reporting on immigration issues had earned her a regional Emmy nomination last year, and her documentary series on housing discrimination had been picked up by a major streaming service. The passenger, a teenage girl, is showing visible signs of respiratory distress. Isabella continued her narration. She's identified herself as having severe asthma and has a medical alert bracelet which the flight attendant has dismissed as fake jewelry. Comments began flooding her live stream. Isabella had built her reputation on responsible reporting, and her followers trusted her judgment. When she documented injustice, they paid attention. The viewer count climbed rapidly. 500, then 1,000, then 5,000, then 10,000. Isabella was not merely recording passively. She understood the power of her platform, knew that the simple act of bearing witness could change outcomes. When Dr. Hernandez stood up to intervene, she made sure to capture his credentials and medical assessment. When Veronica threatened to have the doctor removed, Isabella zoomed in on her name tag, ensuring that accountability would be possible later. What we're seeing, Isabella narrated quietly as the situation continued to unfold, is not just about an inhaler. It's about who gets believed when they say, "I'm in pain," or "I can't breathe." It's about whose medical needs are taken seriously and whose are dismissed. Her viewers responded with outrage. Let Zoe. Breathe began trending within minutes. Other passengers on the flight, noticing Isabella's professional approach to documentation, began their own recordings, creating multiple angles of the same incident. Not all passengers appreciated her documentation, however. A middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit turned toward her with an annoyed expression. "Do you have to make everything about race?" he asked loudly. "The airline has protocols. They can't just let people take whatever they want on planes these days." Isabella didn't break her narration, but gave him a level look. "I'm documenting what I observe. The viewers can form their own opinions." The man shook his head and turned back around, muttering about social media troublemakers. When Zoe managed to call her father, Isabella adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she could capture both sides of the interaction. The moment Veronica's face changed during the phone call, Isabella knew something significant had happened. Her journalistic instinct told her to keep rolling to stay focused. "The flight attendant has just returned the inhaler," she reported. "The passenger is now using her medication, though she appears to be in significant distress." Something said during that phone call changed the situation dramatically. The appearance of Captain Marcus Jackson at the aircraft door was a moment Isabella knew would be replayed thousands of times in the coming days. The visual storytelling was undeniable. The powerful figure in full uniform, the stunned flight attendant, the suffering teenager finally receiving her medication. Isabella didn't need to editorialize. The truth plainly captured was powerful enough. As her live stream reached 100,000 viewers, including representatives from major news networks who were already reaching out through direct messages, Isabella realized that her vacation plans might be changing. This story was too important to walk away from. This was why she had become a journalist in the first place, not for recognition or viral moments, but to ensure that truth was witnessed and shared, especially when that truth revealed the painful disparities that still existed in everyday interactions. Sometimes the most important stories weren't found in conflict zones or political arenas, but in ordinary spaces like Seat 23F on a Tuesday morning flight to Los Angeles. Sofia Martinez had survived 10 years at United Airways by carefully navigating the complex politics of commercial aviation. At 38, she had learned which battles to fight and which to sidestep, when to enforce regulations rigidly and when to exercise compassionate discretion. She had also learned through painful experience the cost of challenging authority within the airline's hierarchical structure. 3 years ago, Sofia had reported a senior pilot for showing up to a flight visibly intoxicated. She had followed every protocol, contacted the proper authorities, and ensured passenger safety. For her diligence, she had been technically protected from official retaliation, but subtly punished through schedule changes, undesirable routes, and social isolation from colleagues who viewed her as disloyal. The experience had taught her caution, had made her hesitate before intervening in situations that didn't directly involve safety violations. But as she watched Veronica Ellis confiscate a young passenger's inhaler, something in Sophia rebelled against that hard-earned caution. This wasn't about loyalty or hierarchy. This was about a teenager who couldn't breathe. Sophia had joined the confrontation midway, called forward by the captain's inquiry about the delay. Veronica's explanation about contraband had immediately struck her as excessive, especially when she saw the obvious medical distress of the young passenger. "Did you check her medical documentation?" Sophia had asked, hoping to offer Veronica a graceful way to back down without direct confrontation. When Veronica dismissed the medical ID bracelet as probably fake, Sophia felt a chill of recognition. She had seen this pattern before with Veronica. An initial judgment based on appearance, followed by a rigid refusal to reconsider regardless of evidence. Usually, Sophia navigated around these moments, addressing passenger concerns privately after Veronica moved on. But this situation was escalating too quickly, the medical consequences too immediate to defer. "That's a legitimate medical alert bracelet," Sophia stated firmly after examining Zoe's wrist. She recognized the standardized format used by reputable medical ID companies, noted the specific medical condition and medication listed. This wasn't a questionable case requiring judgment calls. This was textbook medical accommodation that every flight attendant was trained to recognize. Sophia's intervention placed her in a difficult position with her colleague Thomas Walsh, who had clearly aligned himself with Veronica. Thomas was a relatively new hire, but had quickly established himself as someone who rigidly enforced rules and sought approval from senior staff. His support of Veronica complicated Sophia's attempt to de-escalate the situation without creating a visible split among the crew. "We need to be consistent," Thomas had said, echoing Veronica's position. "If we start making exceptions, where does it end?" "This isn't about exceptions," Sophia had replied quietly. "This is about recognizing legitimate medical needs. It's in our training manual." Veronica's continued resistance triggered a cascade of risk assessments in Sophia's mind. There was the immediate medical risk to the passenger whose breathing was becoming alarmingly labored. There was the regulatory risk. United's policies on medical accommodations were clear, and they were being flagrantly violated. There was the public relations risk as passengers openly recorded the confrontation. And there was the personal career risk to Sophia herself, intervening against a senior colleague. When Dr. Hernandez identified himself and offered his medical assessment, Sophia felt momentary relief. Here was external validation that could potentially break the deadlock without requiring her to directly challenge Veronica's authority. But Veronica's dismissal of even this expert opinion left Sophia with a stark choice between protocol and conscience. "I think we should return the medication while we verify." Sophia began placing a hand on Veronica's arm, offering one last professional off-ramp. "I've made my decision," Veronica hissed, pulling away. In that moment, Sophia understood that Veronica was beyond rational persuasion. Something personal was driving her behavior, some need to maintain control that had overtaken professional judgment. Sophia had seen it before in other colleagues. The moment when the power inherent in their position became more important than the purpose of that position. When Zoe answered her father's call and handed the phone to Veronica, Sophia watched her colleague's face carefully. The transformation was instantaneous and alarming. Veronica's expression shifted from righteous certainty to shocked recognition, followed by the dawning horror of someone who suddenly realizes they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Who is it?" Sophia whispered, though she was beginning to suspect the answer based on Veronica's reaction. Veronica didn't respond, frozen in place as if turned to stone. It was only when Captain Marcus Jackson appeared at the aircraft door that Sophia understood the full magnitude of the situation. She recognized him immediately. Not just as a captain, but as the director of flight operations, one of the most powerful figures in the airline's leadership structure. In that moment, Sophia's immediate concern shifted from the medical emergency, which was resolving as Zoe used her inhaler to damage control, for what was clearly about to become a major incident. Her training kicked in: document the facts, protect the passengers, prepare for investigation. But beneath the professional response, Sophia felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the young passenger was receiving needed medication, validation that her own assessment of the situation had been correct, apprehension about the fallout that would inevitably follow, and a small, difficult-to-admit sense of satisfaction that Veronica's behavior would finally face real consequences. As Captain Jackson moved purposefully down the aisle toward his daughter, Sophia stepped back, giving him space while remaining present. Whatever happened next would likely end Veronica's career. It might impact Sophia's as well, depending on how her attempts at intervention were judged. But in this moment, watching Zoe's breathing begin to normalize as the medication took effect, Sophia couldn't bring herself to regret choosing human welfare over hierarchical deference. Some lines once crossed transformed a person. Sophia suspected that today would prove to be one of those lines for everyone involved. The Boeing 777 bound for Los Angeles had become an unlikely theater for human drama, with 308 passengers serving as both audience and participants in the unfolding crisis. Their reactions, as varied as their backgrounds, created a microcosm of society's response to injustice. In first class, where Michael Blackwell, CEO of Eclipse Airlines, sat with his laptop open, but forgotten, the reaction was one of calculated observation. A veteran of the industry, he recognized the disaster unfolding in real time. Not just a medical emergency, but a catastrophic failure of customer service and corporate values. His trained eye noted everything: the flight attendant's body language, the passenger's obvious distress, the increasing documentation by other passengers. Each element registered as a case study in what not to do lessons he would take back to his own airline's training department. "This will be in business schools next semester," he murmured to his assistant across the aisle. "How to destroy a company's reputation in 20 minutes or less." Not everyone in first class shared his perspective, however. 2 rows behind him, investment banker William Foster leaned toward his colleague with a different take. "Everyone's so quick to cry discrimination," he said, just loud enough to be heard by those around him. "The airlines have protocols for a reason. If they let every person take whatever they want on board without verification, imagine the security risks." His comment drew sharp looks from several nearby passengers, but a few nodded in agreement, creating small factions within the cabin, those who prioritized rigid rule enforcement versus those who saw the human emergency unfolding. In the premium economy section, Professor Diane Reynolds from Yale Law School was documenting the incident with academic precision. Her legal pad already contained 2 pages of notes, each violation of federal regulations, airline policies, and potential civil liabilities carefully categorized and time-stamped. As a specialist in transportation law, she recognized at least 7 actionable offenses in Veronica's behavior, with potential damages in the millions. ADA violation. Clear discrimination. Medical endangerment, she whispered into her voice recorder. Witness testimony from medical professional rejected further endangering patient. Clear evidence of bias in assessment of medical documentation. The middle section of the aircraft held families and older passengers, many of whom watched with growing discomfort. Linda and Robert Whitaker, a retired couple celebrating their 40th anniversary with a trip to California, exchanged troubled glances as the confrontation escalated. "Someone should do something," Linda whispered, her hand squeezing her husband's. "That doctor is trying," Robert replied. "But you know how it is these days. Everyone's afraid to get involved." Yet as Zoe's condition visibly worsened, the atmosphere in the middle cabin shifted from uncomfortable observation to active concern. A mother in row 16 stood up, calling out, "She needs her medicine. Can't you see? She can't breathe." Another passenger, a high school teacher from Queens, added his voice. "This is wrong. Give her the inhaler." But there were dissenting voices, too. A man in a business suit shook his head. "There are rules for a reason. If they start making exceptions, where does it end? What's to stop someone from bringing actual drugs on board and claiming it's medicine? His comment drew both supportive nods and angry glares, illustrating the divided reactions, even as the situation grew more dire. The back of the aircraft, typically the domain of budget travelers, students, and younger passengers, had transformed into an active documentation center. At least 12 phones were recording from various angles, creating a comprehensive visual record that would be impossible to dismiss or reinterpret later. A group of college students returning from a semester abroad formed an impromptu information relay, sharing details about the confrontation with passengers further back, who couldn't see what was happening. "The girl has asthma. Can't breathe," one whispered urgently to those behind him. "Flight attendant took her inhaler, won't give it back." "That's messed up," came the response. "Is someone recording everyone's recording? It's going viral already." Through the cabin, ripples of reaction continued to spread. A nurse from Baltimore pressed her call button repeatedly, trying to offer medical assistance. An off-duty pilot traveling as a passenger made his way forward, hoping to de-escalate the situation professionally. Two high school students who recognized Zoe from a national science competition whispered in shock. "That's Zoe Jackson. She won the Brenner Prize last year. She's brilliant." But perhaps most telling was the reaction of those nearest to Zoe who were witnessing her distress most directly. A businessman who had initially seemed annoyed by the commotion now stood protectively near her row. An elderly woman across the aisle held Zoe's hand, murmuring encouragement. A flight attendant from another section had appeared, looking conflicted as she witnessed her colleague's behavior, but unsure how to intervene without undermining authority. When Zoe managed to call her father and hand the phone to Veronica, the cabin fell into an expectant hush. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. And when Captain Marcus Jackson appeared at the aircraft door minutes later, the collective intake of breath was audible, a moment of recognition that justice had arrived in unexpected form. The passengers of Flight 829 had begun the morning as strangers united only by a common destination. Now they were united by something more profound: collective witness to an injustice and the rare opportunity to see that injustice confronted in real time. For many, it would become a story they would tell for years. "I was there on that flight when that brave girl couldn't breathe, and her father, the captain, arrived like something out of a movie." For others, particularly those who had remained silent despite their discomfort, it would prompt uncomfortable self-reflection about when to speak up and when silence becomes complicity. And for a significant number, the experience would change their future behavior, making them more likely to record, to intervene, to bear witness when they saw someone being wronged. In seat 17D, an 8th grade teacher named Rebecca Wilson whispered to herself words that echoed what many were thinking. Thank God someone important enough to matter was watching. Thank God she wasn't alone. While the drama on United Airways Flight 829 unfolded in the confined space of an aircraft cabin, a parallel storm was brewing in the boundless realm of social media. What began as Isabella Rodriguez's lone live stream rapidly multiplied into a digital phenomenon that transcended platforms, time zones, and demographic boundaries. On Instagram, Isabella's live stream counter ticked upward with dizzying speed: 25,000, 50,000, 75,000 viewers. The comments section became a blur of outrage, hashtags and calls to action. At United Airways. What is happening here? Let Zoe breathe. This is medical discrimination happening in real time. Someone needs to get fired today. That poor girl can't breathe, and they're worried about protocols. Not all comments expressed outrage, however. A vocal minority defended the flight attendant's actions. We don't know the whole story. What if it really was drugs? Airlines have security protocols for a reason. Better safe than sorry. Everyone's so quick to cry racism. Maybe it's just about following rules. These counter-narratives created heated exchanges in the comments, mirroring the divided perspectives within the aircraft cabin itself. but they remained a minority as the overwhelming response sided with Zoe. The Instagram algorithm detecting unusual engagement levels pushed the live stream to the Explore page, where thousands more users discovered it. Within 15 minutes, clips were being screen recorded and shared across other platforms, each snippet containing the most damning moments of Veronica's behavior. On Twitter, "Let Zo Breathe" rocketed to the number 3 trending topic nationally within 20 minutes of Isabella's first broadcast. Media personalities with millions of followers began amplifying the hashtag @CivilRightsNow. Watching this unfold on #United829 is infuriating. A black teenager denied her life-saving medication because she doesn't look like she belongs in first class. In 2025, let Zoe breathe @Dr. Public Health. As a physician, what I'm seeing on this United flight is dangerous medical negligence. Blue lips indicate oxygen deprivation. Without intervention, this could become fatal. Let Zo breathe @Travel Safety. Expert flight attendant, refusing medical accommodation and ignoring a physician's assessment on board. This violates FAA regulations, United's own policies, and basic human decency. Let Zoe breathe. On TikTok, users were already creating reaction videos, stitching clips from the live stream with commentary. One emergency room nurse's medical explanation of asthma attacks and the dangers of delayed treatment gained over 500,000 views in less than an hour. A former flight attendant's video breaking down the proper protocols for medical accommodations garnered similar attention. The corporate response machinery, typically quick to manage potential PR crises, found itself overwhelmed by the speed and scale of the unfolding situation. United's social media team, based in Chicago, received the first alerts about the trending hashtag approximately 7 minutes after Isabella's live stream began. Their initial assessment classified it as potential concern, which quickly escalated to active situation as engagement metrics soared. "This is moving too fast for standard response protocols," the social media director messaged urgently to the corporate communications team. "We need executive-level input immediately." But before a corporate statement could be crafted, the story evolved again as viewers witnessed Zoe's phone call to her father and the dramatic change in Veronica's demeanor. Speculation erupted across platforms. Who did she just call that? Has this flight attendant shook? Look at her face. She just realized she messed with the wrong family bedding. That's not just any dad on the phone. When Captain Marcus Jackson appeared at the aircraft door, the internet's reaction was seismic. Split-screen memes comparing the moment to superhero movie entrances began circulating within seconds. TikTok creators stitched the footage with dramatic music. Twitter users captioned screen grabs with variations of, "And that's when she knew she messed up." On LinkedIn, typically the most restrained of social platforms, aviation industry professionals and healthcare providers engaged in serious discussion about the implications. Dr. Amara Wilson, hospital administrator. What we're witnessing is the intersection of multiple broken systems: medical bias, corporate authority structures that punish intervention, and transportation regulations that prioritize procedure over human welfare. This will be a case study in my healthcare management course next semester. James Thornton, former FAA inspector. I've investigated hundreds of airline incidents. The liability implications here are enormous, extending beyond the flight attendant to potentially include the airline's training programs, supervision protocols, and accommodation policies. Not all social media response was supportive, however. A small but vocal minority began questioning the narrative, suggesting the incident was being overblown or even staged. How convenient that a professional journalist just happened to be there with perfect equipment. Notice how no one's showing what happened before the video started. What if she was actually disruptive? Another race-baiting viral moment to drive clicks and views. So tired of this. These counter-narratives gained limited traction but illustrated the polarized nature of public discourse even in the face of documented injustice. By the time Captain Jackson had reached his daughter's row, the story had transcended social media and broken into mainstream news coverage. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Developing United Airways flight attendant denies teen life-saving medication. Father Who is airline captain intervenes." MSNBC had already booked a panel of medical experts and civil rights attorneys to discuss the implications for the evening broadcast. In United's corporate headquarters, phones were ringing across every department. The CEO's executive assistant was fielding calls from board members demanding information. The legal department had begun pulling all relevant policies on medical accommodations and employee conduct. The PR team was drafting multiple versions of statements, unsure which would be appropriate for a situation still actively unfolding. What made this particular social media storm different from the typical outrage cycle was its unfiltered authenticity. There were no edited clips, no contextless moments open to interpretation. Isabella's continuous live stream, supplemented by footage from multiple passengers, provided an unbroken narrative that corporate spin doctors couldn't easily reframe. As Zoe finally received her inhaler and took her first proper breath in nearly 20 minutes, a collective digital sigh of relief swept across the internet. But relief quickly gave way to demands for accountability. Okay, she can breathe, but what happens to the flight attendant who almost killed her? Don't let United sweep this under the rug. We're all witnesses now. This isn't just about one bad employee. This is about a culture that made her comfortable doing this. What had begun as a single incident on a single flight had transformed through the amplifying power of social media into a national conversation about who gets believed when they say, "I need help," whose medical concerns are taken seriously, and how authority can become weaponized against the vulnerable. And as Captain Marcus Jackson stood in the aisle of Flight 829 facing the flight attendant who had endangered his daughter's life, he was unaware that millions of people were now watching, waiting to see what justice looked like when it finally arrived. The world was beginning to blur around the edges. Zoe Jackson had experienced asthma attacks before, the suffocating tightness, the burning chest, the rising panic as each breath became more difficult than the last. But never without her medication nearby, never with someone actively preventing her from accessing the relief she desperately needed. Each breath was a battle now. Inhale. Her chest muscles strained, pulling against the invisible vice constricting her airways. Exhale. A high-pitched wheeze escaped audible to passengers several rows away. Her lungs felt simultaneously empty and heavy, like balloons filled with concrete instead of air. The medical term was bronchospasm, the tightening of the muscles around the airways. But to Zoe, it wasn't a clinical condition. It was drowning on dry land, suffocating in plain sight while a plane full of witnesses watched. Her vision began to tunnel darkness creeping in from the periphery. The oxygen in her bloodstream was dropping dangerously low, causing the blue color that Dr. Hernandez had noticed in her lips. Without intervention, the lack of oxygen would progress to potential brain damage within minutes. Through the fog of oxygen deprivation, fragmented thoughts tumbled through Zoe's mind. Her grandmother's funeral, which she might now never attend. The MIT acceptance letter in her bag, a future that was slipping away with each labored breath. Her father, who had taught her to stay calm in emergencies, who had helped her manage her condition since childhood. A memory surfaced. She was 8 years old, experiencing a severe attack during a school field trip. The panic in her teacher's eyes, the scramble for her inhaler, the terrifying moments before relief came. Afterward, her father had sat beside her hospital bed, his uniform still on after rushing from the airport. "Zoe," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your asthma is not a weakness. It's just a challenge, and you're stronger than any challenge life throws at you. But you must always protect yourself. Never let anyone tell you your health isn't important." Now, 9 years later, those words echoed as she struggled to maintain consciousness. The inhaler, her lifeline, remained in Veronica Ellis's grasp, held aloft like evidence in a trial where Zoe had already been judged and convicted based on appearances. Another memory surfaced. Her mother's voice. Dr. Amara Jackson had been a specialist in respiratory medicine before her death from a sudden aneurysm when Zoe was 8. Breathe with your diaphragm when you can, she had taught Zoe. Lower your shoulders. Try to relax your chest muscles. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Zoe, even in her distress. Her mother had dedicated her life to helping people breathe, and now Zoe was fighting for air, while her mother's expertise lived on only in memory. The physical symptoms were worsening by the second. The muscles between her ribs, the intercostals, visibly pulled inward with each attempted breath, creating hollow depressions in her chest. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool cabin air. Her pulse raced as her heart worked desperately to compensate for declining oxygen levels. Dr. Hernandez had appeared beside her, his presence both comforting and concerning. If a physician was sufficiently alarmed to leave his seat against crew instructions, her condition must be deteriorating faster than she realized. "Young lady," he said gently, his voice cutting through the roaring in her ears, "I'm a doctor. On a scale of 1 to 10, how severe is your breathing difficulty?" Zoe raised 8 fingers, unable to spare the breath for words. She saw understanding and concern flash across his face. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just a severe attack. It was potentially life-threatening. Her phone continued to buzz in her lap. Dad. Her father always seemed to sense when she needed him, even from a distance. With trembling fingers, she finally answered, raising the phone to her ear. "Dad." She wheezed the word barely audible. "Can't breathe. They took my inhaler." His response was immediate, his voice shifting instantly from concern to decisive action. "Who took your inhaler?" "Zoe. Put them on the phone now." Summoning her remaining strength, Zoe extended the phone toward Veronica. "My father wants to speak with you." As the phone left her hand, Zoe focused entirely on the mechanics of breathing. Inhale, pause, exhale, repeat. Her grandmother had taught her meditation techniques to manage anxiety during asthma episodes. "Your mind can panic, or it can help," Grandma Eliza would say. "Choose to help yourself." The confrontation continued around her, but it seemed distant now, happening in another world as she concentrated on drawing whatever oxygen she could into her starving lungs. She was vaguely aware of Dr. Hernandez beside her, of passengers standing in protest of cameras recording of Veronica's face draining of color as she spoke to Marcus Jackson. Then suddenly the inhaler was back in her hand, the familiar blue plastic life preserver that had saved her countless times before. With practiced motion despite her trembling fingers, Zoe shook the canister, removed the cap, and placed it between her lips. She pressed down, releasing a measured dose of albuterol, and inhaled as deeply as her constricted airways would allow. The first dose wasn't magic. Asthma medications don't work like movie cures, instant and complete. But within seconds, she felt the first subtle relaxation of the bronchial muscles, the first hint that air could move more freely. She waited 30 seconds as she'd been taught, then took a second dose. The relief built gradually. The crushing pressure eased incrementally. The darkness at the edges of her vision began to recede. She could hear more clearly now. The concerned murmurs of passengers, Dr. Hernandez asking about her symptoms, Sophia Martinez apologizing repeatedly. The cabin door opened wider. Through tear-blurred vision, Zoe saw a familiar silhouette, tall, commanding in the dark uniform and gold stripes she had known all her life. Her father had arrived like he always did when she needed him most. As the medication continued to work, as her breathing became less labored with each passing minute, Zoe felt something unexpected alongside her relief, a quiet, steely determination. What had happened to her wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a fundamental wrong that needed to be addressed. She had nearly lost her life because someone had looked at her and decided she didn't deserve to be believed. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. "Sometimes, baby girl, you have to be the change you want to see." As oxygen returned to her brain and clarity to her thoughts, Zoe Jackson made a decision. This wouldn't be just another incident swept under the corporate rug. This would be a reckoning. And as her father approached his face, a mask of professional calm belied by the storm in his eyes, she knew she wouldn't face that reckoning alone. Officers Carlos Jackson and Brian Miller had responded to dozens of calls from gate agents and flight attendants during their tenure with the Transportation Security Administration at JFK. Most involved straightforward security concerns, unattended bags, prohibited items discovered during flight, occasionally disruptive passengers. They had developed an efficient routine for these situations, assess document resolve with minimal disruption to operations. But as they approached United Airways Flight 829 that morning, something felt different. The gate agent who had summoned them appeared unusually tense, providing vague details about a situation with contraband medication that required immediate attention. The urgency in her voice contrasted with the sketchy information provided. Flight attendant Ellis requested assistance with a passenger refusing to surrender an unverified substance. She explained, her eyes darting toward the jet bridge. "That's all I know." Officer Miller, a 52-year-old veteran with 15 years of TSA experience, exchanged a glance with his younger partner. In their world of precisely defined protocols, vague descriptions raised red flags. "Passenger information," Miller asked, pulling out his tablet to log the incident. "Female teenage coach section. That's all I have." Officer Jackson, 27, and just 3 years into his TSA career, felt a twinge of uneasiness. "Medical substance," he asked. "Did they specify what type?" The gate agent shook her head. "Just that it wasn't properly documented and needed to be confiscated." As they made their way down the jet bridge, Miller briefed his partner in low tones. "Let's assess before taking any action. If it's a legitimate medical item, we have discretion. Remember the epilepsy medication case last month?" Jackson nodded. That incident had involved a similar call-out for undocumented medication that turned out to be prescription anticonvulsants with proper medical documentation. The passenger had simply been unable to produce the paper prescription the flight attendant had demanded, despite having the pharmacy label on the bottle. "I've got a cousin with asthma," Jackson added. "If it's an inhaler, those are standard approved items. We see them all the time in carry-ons." The atmosphere that greeted them as they stepped onto the aircraft was charged with tension. Multiple passengers were standing despite the seatbelt sign. Phones were raised throughout the cabin recording. A commotion near the middle of the coach section appeared to be the epicenter of the disturbance. "Something's not right," Jackson murmured to his partner. "This doesn't feel like a standard contraband situation." They moved forward cautiously, noting the agitated expressions of passengers they passed. Fragments of conversation reached them. "Can't believe they took her inhaler. She can't breathe. Recording everything." As they approached row 23, the situation came into clear view. A teenage girl was hunched forward in her seat, visibly struggling to breathe. An older man who identified himself as a physician was kneeling beside her, monitoring her condition. A flight attendant stood rigidly nearby, holding what appeared to be a standard albuterol inhaler. Another crew member hovered uncertainly at the periphery. TSA Miller announced formally, "We were called about a prohibited item." The senior flight attendant, Ellis, according to her name tag, turned to them with visible relief. "This passenger claims she needs this unverified medication," she said, gesturing with the inhaler. "She hasn't provided proper documentation, and I suspect it may be modified for drug use." Officer Jackson looked from the inhaler to the struggling teenager, his training and instincts suddenly at odds. The blue rescue inhaler was immediately recognizable to him. His cousin had severe asthma and carried an identical one. The girl's labored breathing, blue-tinged lips, and the medical ID bracelet visible on her wrist painted a picture that contradicted Veronica's assessment. "Ma'am," he said carefully to Veronica, "that appears to be a standard albuterol inhaler prescribed for asthma. She hasn't provided a prescription." Veronica insisted, and her behavior has been combative. Dr. Hernandez stood up, addressing the officers directly. "I'm Dr. Rafael Hernandez, former chief of pulmonology at Mount Sinai. This young woman is experiencing a severe asthma attack and requires immediate medication. Without it, we risk respiratory failure and potential cardiac complications." Officer Miller, trained to maintain neutrality in disputed situations, looked to his partner for input. Jackson was already examining Zoe's medical alert bracelet with her permission. "This is a legitimate medical ID," he confirmed. "States her condition as severe asthma albuterol required." A male passenger in business attire approached the officers. "These people are making a big deal out of nothing," he said. "The airline has procedures for a reason. Security can't be compromised because someone makes a scene." Officer Jackson maintained his professional demeanor. "Sir, we need to assess the situation based on the evidence before us." The two officers stepped slightly aside for a brief consultation. "Prescription drugs are permitted with proper medical documentation," Miller stated quietly, referencing TSA protocols. "Medical ID constitutes proper documentation under Section 42.3 of our guidelines." "She's in acute medical distress," Jackson added urgently. "This isn't a security threat, it's a medical emergency." Their deliberation was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the aircraft. The door had reopened and a United Airways captain had boarded, moving purposefully down the aisle toward their position. The shift in the cabin atmosphere was immediate and palpable. "That's Captain Jackson Miller," said under his breath, recognizing one of the airline's senior pilots. "Director of Flight Operations." Passengers were whispering now, connecting dots that the officers were still assembling. "That's her father," someone murmured loud enough for them to hear. As Captain Jackson approached, his focus locked on his daughter, Officer Miller made a rapid decision. "We're standing down," he said quietly to his partner. "This is an internal airline matter now, not a security issue. Document everything for the incident report." Officer Jackson nodded, already composing the careful language they would use in their official account. This situation had evolved far beyond a routine contraband check. Whatever happened next would likely involve investigations at multiple levels. As they stepped back to allow Captain Jackson access to his daughter, both officers understood they were now witnesses rather than active participants in whatever would unfold. Their presence would be noted in reports, their observations potentially crucial in subsequent investigations. Neither had expected their Tuesday morning shift to involve a situation that would likely make national news before their lunch break. But as they watched Zoe finally receive her inhaler and take her first proper breath in many minutes, both felt a quiet professional satisfaction. Sometimes the best security work involved knowing when not to intervene. When Dr. Rafael Hernandez had boarded United Flight 829 that morning, his plans had been simple: a comfortable journey to Los Angeles to visit his grandchildren. Perhaps a glass of wine with lunch. Maybe a nap as they crossed the country. At 65, with 4 decades of medical practice behind him, he had earned his peaceful retirement. Yet as he knelt beside Zoe Jackson's seat, monitoring her respiratory rate and the alarming blue tinge of her lips, retirement felt distant. In this moment, he was fully the physician he had been for 40 years, focused, authoritative, and absolutely certain of what needed to happen next. "This young woman requires immediate medical intervention," he announced, rising to his full height despite the twinge in his knees. He addressed his words not just to Veronica Ellis, but to the entire cabin, passengers, crew members, and the TSA officers who had just arrived. "As a licensed physician, I am formally advising that withholding her prescribed medication constitutes a medical emergency." Veronica's expression hardened. "Sir, with all due respect, airline protocols require no airline protocol supersedes the immediate medical needs of a passenger." Dr. Hernandez interrupted his voice, carrying the weight of countless emergency room decisions. What you are witnessing is a severe asthma attack with developing oxygen deprivation. Without intervention, this young woman risks respiratory failure, potential brain injury, and cardiac complications. He simplified his language deliberately, avoiding the technical terms that might confuse non-medical listeners. Years of explaining conditions to patients had taught him that clear communication was often more effective than clinical precision in emergency situations. "I understand your concern about security," he acknowledged, addressing not just Veronica, but the skeptical passengers who had sided with her. "But I am stating as a medical professional with 4 decades of experience that this is a standard asthma inhaler containing albuterol, a medication that is explicitly permitted by TSA regulations and airline policies when accompanied by proper medical identification, which this young woman has provided." He turned to address the TSA officers, directly recognizing their authority in this complex situation. "Officers, I'm formally identifying myself as Dr. Rafael Hernandez, medical license number 285743, New York State. I am providing my professional medical assessment that this passenger requires immediate access to her prescribed albuterol inhaler, which I can identify as standard medical equipment, not a controlled or prohibited substance." The younger TSA officer, Jackson, nodded with visible relief at having expert input. The senior officer, Miller, looked conflicted, but attentive. "Furthermore, Dr. Hernandez continued, I am willing to accept full responsibility for administering this medication if there are concerns about liability." He reached into his pocket and produced his medical license and retired hospital ID card, presenting them to the officers. "You may verify my credentials if necessary, but I urge immediate action." A passenger from the row ahead turned around, adding her voice to his. "I'm a registered nurse, and I agree with the doctor's assessment. She needs her medication now." A businessman in a suit countered from across the aisle. "We can't just ignore security protocols because someone claims to be a doctor. How do we know this isn't all staged?" Dr. Hernandez turned to face the man directly. "Security is important, sir. So is human life. I'm not asking for an exception to security protocols. I'm pointing out that this situation is fully covered by existing medical accommodation policies that this flight attendant is choosing to ignore." The momentum was shifting. Multiple passengers had stood up, forming an impromptu witness circle around the confrontation. Phones recorded from every angle. The flight supervisor, Sofia Martinez, looked increasingly uncomfortable with Veronica's position. "This isn't about airline authority anymore," Dr. Hernandez said, his voice lower, but no less firm. "This is about a fundamental medical duty of care. In my professional opinion, continuing to withhold this medication constitutes negligence and could potentially be considered reckless endangerment given the clear symptoms of respiratory distress." He turned back to Zoe, kneeling again to check her pulse. Rapid thready. Her cardiovascular system was under significant stress as it struggled to compensate for decreased oxygen. Every second mattered now. Looking up at Veronica, who still clutched the inhaler, Dr. Hernandez made one final appeal, not as a confrontational passenger, but as a physician speaking to another human being, Ms. Ellis, he said quietly, using her name from her badge. "I understand you're following what you believe is proper procedure, but right now you're looking at a young woman who cannot breathe. Whatever concerns you have about documentation can be addressed after she receives the medication she needs. Please, as someone who has taken an oath to preserve life, I'm asking you to return her inhaler." For a moment it seemed Veronica might relent. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but before she could respond, Zoe's phone rang again, the same persistent caller who had been trying to reach her throughout the confrontation. With trembling hands, Zoe answered and managed a few breathless words before extending the phone toward Veronica. "My father wants to speak with you." The cabin fell silent as Veronica took the phone. Dr. Hernandez watched her expression transform from rigid authority to shock, then to dawning horror as the voice on the other end spoke. When she finally lowered the phone, her hand was shaking. Without a word, she handed the inhaler to Zoe, who immediately administered a dose. 2 puffs, Dr. Hernandez instructed gently. Wait 30 seconds between doses. As Zoe followed his instructions, Dr. Hernandez continued to monitor her closely. The medication would take a few minutes to fully relax the constricted airways. But even the first dose would begin to provide relief. The aircraft door opened wider, and Captain Marcus Jackson appeared in his full United Airways uniform. The cabin's atmosphere shifted instantly from tension to anticipation. Dr. Hernandez stood again, stepping slightly aside to give the captain access to his daughter, while remaining close enough to continue monitoring her condition. As a physician, his primary concern remained Zoe's medical stability. But as a human being who had witnessed an unconscionable abuse of authority, he felt a profound satisfaction seeing the tables turn so dramatically. Captain Jackson approached his focus entirely on his daughter in the first crucial moments. Then, after assuring himself that she was receiving treatment and beginning to stabilize, he turned his attention to the flight attendant who had endangered her life. Dr. Hernandez remained beside Zoe, a steady professional presence as the confrontation's next chapter began to unfold. His role in this drama wasn't finished. He would provide a medical assessment of Zoe's condition, would document the incident for potential investigation, would serve as an expert witness if necessary. But in this moment, watching color gradually return to Zoe's face as the medication took effect, he felt the simple satisfaction that had sustained him through 40 years of medicine. A patient who could breathe again, a life preserved, the fundamental principle of first do no harm, upheld despite those who would place procedure above human welfare. The buzzing phone in Zoe's lap had become a lifeline vibrating with increasing urgency, as if it understood the desperation of the situation. Each missed call from Dad represented another lost opportunity for intervention as her breathing grew more labored and her vision more blurred. By the time she finally answered, her condition had deteriorated significantly. The simple act of raising the phone to her ear required concentration and effort that would have been unimaginable 20 minutes earlier. Through the fog of oxygen deprivation, she heard her father's voice, strong, steady, the voice that had guided her through every crisis of her young life. "Zoe, are you there? I've been trying to reach you for 15 minutes. Dad," she managed to wheeze the word barely audible. "Can't breathe. They took my inhaler." The transformation in Marcus Jackson's tone was immediate and absolute. Gone was the concerned father, replaced by the commanding officer who directed thousands of aviation professionals. "Who took your inhaler?" "Zoe." "Put them on the phone now." With trembling fingers, Zoe extended the phone toward Veronica Ellis. "My father wants to speak with you." The cabin fell silent. Every passenger within view focused on this crucial moment of transition, the point where power would shift irrevocably. Veronica hesitated briefly before taking the phone, her professional mask still in place, but beginning to show cracks of uncertainty. "This is Flight Attendant Ellis. We're managing a situation with your daughter's unverified." She stopped abruptly, the color draining from her face as the voice on the other end spoke. Around her, the cabin had gone completely silent, passengers straining to hear the one-sided conversation. Even Sophia leaned closer, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "Yes, sir," Veronica stammered. "I understand, but protocols require—" She fell silent again, listening. Her hand began to tremble visibly. The phone shook against her ear. She didn't explain. "I wasn't aware." Another pause, longer this time. Isabella Rodriguez's camera zoomed in, capturing the moment Veronica's professional facade crumbled completely. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, sensing a seismic shift in the confrontation's power dynamics. "You're where?" The final question seemed to hang in the air. Confusion rippled through the cabin. Passengers looked at each other with questioning expressions. How could Zoe's father be close enough to intervene directly if he was calling from elsewhere? Through her oxygen-starved haze, Zoe felt a surge of validation. She recognized the tone in her father's voice, the calm, measured authority that could reshape reality through sheer force of will. It was the voice he used when addressing subordinates who had made serious errors, when testifying before aviation safety boards, when delivering news that would brook no argument or appeal. What passengers couldn't hear was the exact content of that conversation, words that would later be confirmed through Captain Jackson's formal incident report. "This is Captain Marcus Jackson, United Airways employee number 5823, Director of Flight Operations for the Eastern Division. You are currently withholding life-saving medication from my 17-year-old daughter who has documented severe asthma. This constitutes a direct violation of United's medical accommodation policy, FAA regulations regarding passenger welfare, and potentially criminal negligence. I am currently at JFK Terminal 8 walking toward your gate, and I will be boarding that aircraft in approximately 3 minutes. If my daughter does not have her medication in her hand by the time I reach your position, I will personally ensure that you never work in commercial aviation again. Is that perfectly clear?" Veronica lowered the phone slowly, her face ashen. Without a word, she handed the inhaler back to Zoe, who immediately brought it to her lips and triggered a life-saving dose of medicine. The relief wasn't instant, but the medication began to open her airways, easing the crushing pressure in her chest. "What did he say?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Veronica didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, frozen in place like a statue, as the enormity of her mistake began to dawn on her. In the silence that followed, Zoe's phone slipped from Veronica's fingers back into the teenager's lap, the call still connected. The TSA officers, who had been assessing the situation with increasing concern, exchanged glances. Something significant had just happened, though they weren't yet privy to the details. Zoe took a second dose of her medication following the 30-second spacing she'd been taught. Each breath came slightly easier than the last as the albuterol worked to relax her constricted airways. Through the lingering fog of oxygen deprivation, she became aware of a growing commotion at the front of the aircraft. Passengers were turning in their seats, craning necks to see something, or someone, at the entry door. Dr. Hernandez remained beside her, monitoring her recovery with professional attention. "Your color is improving," he noted quietly. "How's your breathing now?" "Better." Zoe managed her voice, weak but audible. "Thank you." The aircraft door opened wider, and a commanding figure appeared in the entryway. Captain Marcus Jackson, in full United Airways uniform with 4 gold stripes on his sleeves, stepped into the cabin. His eyes scanned the scene with military precision until they locked on his daughter. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly from tension to electric anticipation. Veronica Ellis, still holding her position near Zoe's seat, seemed to physically shrink as she recognized the uniformed figure moving purposefully down the aisle. In that moment, Zoe understood something fundamental about power and accountability. For years, she had witnessed small injustices, had experienced moments of prejudice and dismissal that were difficult to prove or address. So had countless others who lacked the protection of a father with captain's stripes and corporate authority. The system that had nearly suffocated her today routinely crushed those without powerful advocates. As Marcus Jackson approached his face, a mask of professional calm belied by the storm in his eyes, Zoe made a silent promise to herself and to her grandmother's memory. Whatever happened next, whatever justice her father's position made possible today, would not be the end of this story. It would be the beginning of something larger, something that might help those who didn't have a captain for a father or a viral video to demand accountability. Captain Jackson reached her row, kneeling beside her seat with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to moving efficiently in aircraft cabins. "Zoe," he said quietly. His public voice temporarily set aside as he checked her condition. "How bad, 8?" she whispered, using their familiar scale. "Down to maybe a 6 now." He nodded, relief visible only in the slight relaxation around his eyes. Then, as he stood and turned toward Veronica Ellis, Zoe saw her father transform before her eyes, from concerned parent to the embodiment of institutional authority. His posture straightened, his expression settled into impassive professional judgment, and his voice, when he spoke, carried throughout the hushed cabin. "Flight Attendant Ellis," he said, each word precisely measured. "I believe we need to have a conversation about United Airways policies on medical accommodations." The reckoning had arrived, and 308 passengers were about to witness what happened when institutional indifference collided with individual accountability in the confined space of an aircraft cabin at JFK International Airport. Flight Attendant Ellis Captain Marcus Jackson said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of command authority. "I believe we need to have a conversation about United Airways policies on medical accommodations." The cabin fell silent, every passenger frozen in place as they watched the confrontation unfold. Captain Jackson stood at his full height of 6'2", his dark uniform with 4 gold stripes on each sleeve, impeccably pressed his posture military straight, despite the low ceiling of the aircraft cabin. At 46, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and features that reflected both strength and intelligence, he projected an aura of absolute authority. Veronica Ellis seemed to physically shrink before him, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist under a harsh sun. "Captain," she began, her voice barely audible, "I was following protocol for unverified medications. Let me be absolutely clear about who I am and what has happened here today." Captain Jackson interrupted, his tone professional, but with an undertone of controlled fury that sent chills through the cabin. "I am Captain Marcus Jackson, United Airways employee number 5823, Director of Flight Operations for the Eastern Division, and more relevantly at this moment, the father of the young woman whose life you endangered through your assumptions and prejudice." The formal introduction landed like physical blows. Nearby passengers exhaled audibly, some nodding in grim satisfaction. Isabella Rodriguez's live stream captured the moment perfectly, her camera steady as she documented what was quickly becoming a textbook example of accountability in action. "Sir, there was no way to verify," Veronica attempted again. "There were multiple ways to verify," Captain Jackson corrected her, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire aircraft. "My daughter presented her boarding pass for her assigned first-class seat, which you redirected her from without explanation. She showed you her medical ID bracelet, which you dismissed as fake jewelry. A licensed physician identified himself and confirmed her medical condition, which you ignored. At every decision point, Flight Attendant Ellis, you chose the interpretation that allowed you to exercise power rather than extend basic human dignity." He paused, his eyes sweeping the cabin, acknowledging the many passengers who were recording the interaction. "And you did this in front of hundreds of witnesses, many of whom recognized the danger before you did." Thomas Walsh, the flight attendant who had supported Veronica's actions, attempted to interject. "Captain, we were just trying to follow security protocols." "In today's environment, Flight Attendant Walsh." Captain Jackson cut him off without raising his voice. "I'm well aware of our security protocols. I helped write many of them. Nothing in those protocols authorizes denying a clearly identified medical device to a passenger in respiratory distress. Your support of this situation will be addressed separately." Walsh fell silent, his face reddening as he realized his career might also be in jeopardy. Sophia Martinez stepped forward cautiously. "Captain Jackson, I tried to intervene when I realized we'll address individual roles in this incident during the formal investigation." "Ms. Martinez," Captain Jackson replied, his tone slightly softer but no less authoritative. Right now, my primary concern is my daughter's medical condition. He turned to Dr. Hernandez, who had remained beside Zoe throughout the confrontation. Doctor, thank you for your intervention. What's your assessment of her current condition? Dr. Hernandez straightened, responding to the captain's professionalism with his own. She's stabilizing with medication. Oxygen levels are improving, though still below optimal. I'd recommend continued monitoring and possibly supplemental oxygen if available. She'll need follow-up care when you reach your destination. Captain Jackson nodded. Thank you, Doctor. Your expertise and courage today are deeply appreciated. He turned to one of the other flight attendants who had appeared in the aisle. Please bring the emergency oxygen kit immediately. The flight attendant hurried to comply, relieved to have clear direction amidst the chaos. Returning his attention to Veronica Ellis, Captain Jackson continued. What happened here today represents a catastrophic failure of training judgment and basic human compassion. As Director of Flight Operations, I could detail the numerous United Airways policies you've violated. As a captain, I could enumerate the federal aviation regulations you've breached. But as a father who just watched his daughter struggle to breathe while you held her life-saving medication hostage, I'm struggling to find words adequate to address your conduct. Veronica's face had lost all color. Sir, I didn't know she was your daughter. The statement hung in the air, revealing more than any carefully crafted explanation could have. Captain Jackson's expression hardened further. That he said each word like carved granite is precisely the problem, Ms. Ellis. Her humanity should have been enough. Her medical need should have been enough. The professional assessment of a physician should have been enough. The fact that you would have treated her differently if you'd known she was connected to someone with authority reveals everything about your judgment and character. Passengers throughout the cabin nodded in agreement. Some applauded briefly before quieting themselves, sensing that the confrontation was still unfolding. Not everyone was convinced by Captain Jackson's intervention, however. The businessman who had defended airline protocols earlier spoke up again, though with considerably less confidence. Captain, with all due respect, if we make exceptions to protocol, doesn't that compromise the whole system? Captain Jackson turned to address him directly. Sir, this isn't about exceptions. United Airways Policy 5.3.2 explicitly states that medical identification must be accepted as valid, and crew members must prioritize passenger safety in cases of doubt. Flight Attendant Ellis didn't follow protocol. She violated it repeatedly and dangerously. The businessman nodded, effectively, silenced by Captain Jackson's command of both policy details and moral authority. Captain Sophia interjected cautiously. The flight is now 27 minutes delayed. Ground Operations is asking for an update on our status. Ground Operations will be informed that this aircraft is now under investigation for a serious safety incident. Captain Jackson replied without hesitation. No passenger will be inconvenienced further by being forced to remain on board, but this aircraft will not be departing until a full initial assessment has been conducted. He turned to address the cabin at large, his voice shifting to the reassuring tones of a captain addressing passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the continued delay. United Airways will be arranging immediate alternative transportation for everyone on board. Customer service representatives will meet you at the gate with compensation information and rebooking assistance. This will happen as quickly as possible, but this aircraft will not be departing today. The announcement caused murmurs throughout the cabin, but notably little protest. Most passengers seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and the necessity of the captain's decision. Captain Jackson's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it briefly. The CEO is calling for a full briefing. Ms. Martinez, please ensure all passengers deplane in an orderly fashion once the jet bridge is reattached. Flight Attendant Ellis, you will remain on board with me for the preliminary incident documentation. Veronica nodded mutely. All pretense of authority completely evaporated. As the supplemental oxygen arrived for Zoe, Captain Jackson knelt beside his daughter once more, briefly setting aside his official role to check on her condition. Better, he asked quietly. Much better now. Thank you for coming. Always, he replied, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of protection and care. Rising again, Captain Jackson addressed the TSA officers who had remained nearby, witnesses to the entire confrontation. Officers, I'll need your contact information for the official incident report. Your observations will be valuable to the investigation. As the officers provided their information, passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing for deplaning. The atmosphere had transformed from tension to a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The rare opportunity to witness justice being served in real time, to see accountability imposed without equivocation or delay. Captain Marcus Jackson stood in the aisle of Flight 829, simultaneously a father protecting his child, a captain ensuring passenger safety, and a senior executive upholding company values. In all three roles, his message was unmistakable. Some lines once crossed demanded immediate and consequential response, and today that line had been crossed by someone who never imagined she would face judgment from a man with gold stripes on his sleeves and his daughter's well-being in his heart. As the passengers of United Flight 829 watched in rapt attention, Captain Marcus Jackson continued his methodical dismantling of Veronica Ellis's actions, moving from policy violations to the broader implications of what had occurred. What happened today represents a fundamental breakdown in the trust passengers place in our airline, he said, his voice carrying throughout the silent cabin. When someone boards a United aircraft, they entrust us not just with their transportation, but with their safety, their dignity, and in cases like this, their very lives. Veronica stood motionless, her company ID and wings already removed, tears streaming silently down her face. The transformation was striking, from the confident, authoritative figure who had confiscated Zoe's inhaler to this diminished presence, stripped of power and position in front of hundreds of witnesses. The financial implications alone are staggering. Captain Jackson continued shifting to the business impact of her actions. This incident will now require rebooking 308 passengers on alternative flights, compensating them for their inconvenience, removing this aircraft from service for a full investigation, and addressing what will undoubtedly become a significant public relations challenge. He consulted his tablet briefly. Conservative estimates put the direct cost of your decisions today at approximately $350,000. Not including potential legal liability, which could easily reach into the millions given the documented nature of the misconduct. The clinical assessment of costs landed with visible impact on both Veronica and the watching passengers. This wasn't just about one employee's poor judgment anymore. This was about institutional consequences that would affect an entire organization. But the true cost cannot be measured in dollars. Captain Jackson said, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its authority. The true cost was nearly paid by my daughter, who experienced a life-threatening medical emergency while a United Airways employee withheld her prescribed medication. The true cost is measured in the trust broken with every passenger who witnessed this incident and will now question whether they too might be subjected to such treatment. The true cost is to the reputation of thousands of dedicated United employees who serve our passengers with respect and compassion every day. Dr. Hernandez, still monitoring Zoe's condition, nodded in agreement. As a physician, he understood the concept of cascading failures, how one initial misjudgment could trigger a series of increasingly serious consequences if not corrected early. I want to be absolutely clear about something, Captain Jackson continued, addressing not just Veronica, but the entire cabin. What we witnessed today was not simply a customer service failure. It was not merely a misunderstanding. It was a dangerous exercise of bias that could have resulted in loss of life. He paused, allowing the gravity of this assessment to register with everyone listening. When my daughter presented her medical ID bracelet, and you dismissed it as fake jewelry without examination, that was bias in action. When you looked at a young black woman in casual clothes and decided she couldn't possibly belong in first class, that was bias in action. When you chose to believe she was bringing drugs aboard rather than medication, despite all evidence to the contrary, that was bias in action. The directness of his addressing racial bias caused a ripple of reactions throughout the cabin. Nods of recognition from some passengers, uncomfortable shifting from others, and murmurs of agreement from many. By naming the underlying issue explicitly rather than couching it in corporate euphemisms, Captain Jackson had elevated the conversation beyond a single incident to the structural problems it represented. Not everyone was comfortable with this framing, however. A middle-aged woman in business attire spoke up from a few rows ahead. "Captain, with respect, how do you know this was about race? Maybe it was just poor judgment. Not everything is about color." Captain Jackson turned to address her with the same measured calm he had maintained throughout. "Ma'am, I understand your question. In isolation, we might consider alternative explanations. But this incident follows a pattern we've seen repeatedly: highly qualified black passengers being questioned about their presence in first-class medical concerns, of black patients being dismissed at higher rates, and the automatic assumption of wrongdoing rather than giving the benefit of the doubt. When these patterns repeat across thousands of incidents, we must recognize the underlying factor. His response, delivered without defensiveness or accusation, seemed to register with the woman, who nodded slowly. United Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination in any form, he stated firmly. Not because it's politically correct, not because it's mandated by regulations, but because bias is fundamentally incompatible with safety. An airline where judgments are made based on appearances rather than facts, where medical emergencies are dismissed based on prejudice, where authority is wielded to control rather than to protect. That airline is inherently unsafe for all passengers." Veronica attempted to speak again, her voice barely audible. "Captain, I never meant to discriminate, Ms. Ellis." Captain Jackson interrupted his use of her civilian title rather than her crew designation, emphasizing her removed status. "Discrimination is judged by impact, not intent. Whatever you believe was in your heart, your actions created a pattern of discrimination that endangered my daughter's life. That pattern is documented by dozens of witnesses and will be addressed with the seriousness it deserves." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it briefly, then looked back at Veronica. "The CEO and General Counsel are now personally involved in this situation. They have authorized me to inform you that United Airways will be conducting a comprehensive review of all passenger complaints filed against you during your tenure, with particular attention to any incidents involving minority passengers or medical accommodations." This announcement landed like a physical blow. Veronica visibly flinched, suggesting that today's incident might not have been an isolated occurrence, but rather the first time she had faced real consequences for a pattern of behavior. Thomas Walsh, who had supported Veronica earlier, now stood awkwardly at the periphery, trying to distance himself from the situation. Captain Jackson turned his attention to him briefly. "Flight Attendant Walsh, your role in supporting this situation rather than intervening will be reviewed separately. Please report to crew operations with Ms. Ellis after deplaning." Walsh nodded, his face pale with the realization that his career might also be in jeopardy. Captain Jackson turned to address Sophia Martinez. "Ms. Martinez, I'll need access to the crew complaint database for the past 3 years. I want to review every incident involving Flight Attendant Ellis where passengers reported similar concerns." Sophia nodded, her expression professional, but her eyes betraying a hint of knowledge, as if she was already aware of what such a review might reveal. "Yes, Captain. I'll ensure those records are pulled immediately." Throughout the cabin, passengers exchanged glances, many continuing to record the confrontation. Isabella Rodriguez's live stream had now reached over 500,000 viewers, with major news networks beginning to pick up the story. What had begun as a single incident on a single flight had expanded into a public reckoning that would likely reshape policies and practices across the airline industry. Captain Jackson returned his attention to Veronica, his expression grave but not vindictive. "Ms. Ellis, when this investigation is complete, you will have an opportunity to provide your full account of today's events. You will be entitled to union representation during that process. But I want to be completely transparent about the fact that based on what I have already witnessed and confirmed, termination is the expected outcome. The formal procedural language somehow made the consequence more real, more inevitable. This wasn't an emotional reaction or a hasty judgment. This was the methodical application of corporate standards and professional expectations. "Do you understand?" Captain Jackson asked. Veronica nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "I need a verbal confirmation for the record," he insisted gently but firmly. "Yes," she managed. "I understand." Captain Jackson nodded once, then turned to the TSA officers who had remained nearby. "Officers, I'll need your badge numbers and contact information for the official incident report. Your observations will be valuable to the investigation." As the officers provided their information, Zoe Jackson watched the entire interaction with an expression that mixed relief with something more complex. The beginning awareness of the power her father wielded, and how rarely such power was used to address the kinds of everyday discrimination she and others faced. The medical team that Captain Jackson had requested was now waiting at the jet bridge, ready to assess Zoe once deplaning began. The first steps of accountability had been taken, witnessed by hundreds in person and hundreds of thousands online. What had begun as one flight attendant's poor judgment had transformed into a very public lesson about consequences, about bias, and about what happens when authority is challenged by greater authority wielded with purpose and principle. As arrangements continued for passenger deplaning, Captain Marcus Jackson stood in the aisle of Flight 829, simultaneously a father protecting his child and an executive upholding company values. In both roles, his message was unmistakable. Some lines, once crossed, demanded immediate and consequential response. And today that line had been crossed by someone who never imagined the reckoning that would follow. The aircraft cabin remained hushed as Captain Marcus Jackson shifted from assessment to action. The initial shock of his arrival had given way to a collective understanding that they were witnessing something historic, not just a personnel matter, but a moment when institutional power was being used to address an injustice in real time without delay or deflection. "Miss Ellis," Captain Jackson said, his tone shifting slightly as he moved from explanation to decision. "Based on the severity of what has occurred here today, you now face a choice regarding how your separation from United Airways will proceed." The word separation hung in the air, the corporate euphemism making it clear that her continued employment was not among the options. This wasn't a disciplinary meeting with multiple possible outcomes. This was the administrative implementation of a decision already made. "You have two options." Captain Jackson continued, his voice measured but firm. "Option 1, immediate resignation. You submit your formal resignation effective today, citing personal reasons. You will receive standard separation benefits, including 2 weeks' pay in lieu of notice and applicable unused vacation time. Your employment record will reflect resignation rather than termination, which may preserve some future employment opportunities outside United Airways." He paused, allowing the first option to register before presenting the alternative. Throughout the cabin, passengers leaned forward slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment. Isabella Rodriguez zoomed in with her camera, capturing the confrontation in detail for her still-growing online audience. Option 2. Captain Jackson continued formal termination for cause, specifically endangering passenger safety, violation of medical accommodation policies, discriminatory conduct, and gross misconduct, unbecoming of a United Airways employee. This option would result in immediate termination without separation benefits, permanent notation in your employment file regarding the circumstances of your dismissal, and potential industry-wide notification through the airline safety reporting system. The stark contrast between the options caused visible distress in Veronica's already tear-streaked face. Captain Jackson wasn't offering mercy or forgiveness. He was offering a choice between consequences, a final opportunity for her to exercise agency in a situation largely beyond her control. You have 60 seconds to decide, he said, checking his watch with military precision. This is not negotiable, and these are the only options available to you. The ultimatum delivered. Captain Jackson stood silent, his presence commanding the space without additional words. Throughout the cabin, passengers held their breath, many recording what had become the climactic moment of a confrontation that would soon be viewed millions of times across social media platforms and news broadcasts. From the back of the cabin, a voice called out, "She doesn't deserve a choice. She should be fired outright." Captain Jackson turned slightly toward the source of the comment. "Justice without process becomes vengeance," he replied evenly. "United Airways maintains standards of fairness even in cases of clear misconduct." The passenger fell silent, chastened by the captain's measured response. Veronica's breathing grew rapid and shallow, an ironic echo of the symptoms she had dismissed in Zoe earlier. "Captain Jackson," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never intended to harm anyone. I was just trying to follow what I thought was—" 45 seconds. Captain Jackson interrupted, his voice gentle but unyielding. "The time for explanations will come during the formal investigation. Right now, I need your decision." Sophia Martinez stood nearby, her expression professionally neutral, but her posture conveying clear support for Captain Jackson's approach. The TSA officers had stepped back, recognizing that this had moved beyond any security concern into internal airline matters. Dr. Hernandez continued monitoring Zoe, but his attention was partially focused on the confrontation unfolding in the aisle. As a physician who had testified in numerous medical negligence cases, he recognized the careful construction of Captain Jackson's ultimatum, offering a path that acknowledged the severity of the misconduct while providing a marginally less devastating option for the employee. 30 seconds, Captain Jackson announced, his tone unchanged. Passengers throughout the cabin exchanged glances, some uncomfortable with the public nature of the reckoning, others nodding in approval at seeing such direct accountability. A few whispered comments floated through the rows. "This is how it should be handled. No hiding behind corporate process. She nearly killed that girl." Veronica stood, frozen tears streaming down her face, the reality of her situation apparently overwhelming her capacity to respond. The transformation from authority figure to terminated employee had happened with breathtaking speed, leaving her visibly struggling to process the implications. 15 seconds, Captain Jackson said. Zoe watched the countdown with mixed emotions evident on her face. The vindication of seeing her mistreatment addressed was tempered by the human reality of witnessing someone's career end before her eyes. Despite everything Veronica had put her through, Zoe seemed to take no pleasure in her distress, a grace that several nearby passengers noted with quiet approval. "I resign." Veronica finally whispered the words barely audible. "I need that statement clearly for the record," Captain Jackson replied. "Please state your decision in a complete sentence." Veronica took a shuddering breath, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "I, Veronica Ellis, resign from my position with United Airways effective immediately." Captain Jackson nodded once, acknowledging her decision without comment. "Ms. Martinez will escort you to crew operations once passengers have deplaned. You'll need to complete separation paperwork and surrender all company property." He turned to address Flight Attendant Walsh, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing anxiety. "Mr. Walsh, your involvement in this incident will be reviewed separately. You are suspended pending investigation. Please accompany Ms. Ellis to crew operations after deplaning." Walsh nodded mutely, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Captain Jackson then addressed the cabin at large, his voice shifting to the reassuring tones of a captain addressing passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize again for the continued delay. United Airways will be arranging immediate alternative transportation for everyone on board. Customer service representatives will meet you at the gate with compensation information and rebooking assistance." As the jet bridge reconnected to the aircraft for deplaning, Captain Jackson returned his attention to Veronica one final time. "Before you leave this aircraft, there is one more thing required of you." Veronica looked up, her expression a mixture of resignation and dread. "You owe my daughter an apology," Captain Jackson said simply. "Not for your career's sake. That matter is already decided. Not for United Airways' reputation. That will be addressed through other channels. But because a 17-year-old girl deserved to be treated with basic human dignity and instead was subjected to unfounded accusations and dangerous medical neglect." The request, or rather the requirement, silenced the few remaining whispers in the cabin. All attention focused on Veronica as she turned toward Zoe, who was now breathing normally thanks to her medication, but whose expression still carried the memory of her ordeal. "Zoe," Veronica began, her voice breaking, "I am deeply sorry for how I treated you today. I was wrong about your medication, wrong about your medical needs, wrong about everything. What I did was inexcusable, and I hope someday you can forgive me." The apology hung in the air, its sincerity impossible to determine amidst the emotional breakdown of its delivery. Zoe regarded Veronica for a long moment before responding, her voice steady despite the lingering effects of her asthma attack. "I accept your apology," she said simply. "I hope you learn from this." The maturity and composure in her response caused several passengers to nod in approval. There was no vindictiveness in Zoe's words, no desire to further humiliate someone already facing the consequences of their actions. Just a simple acknowledgement and a hope for growth. As Veronica was escorted toward the front of the aircraft by Sofia Martinez, Captain Jackson turned his attention to his daughter's well-being and the logistics of getting 308 passengers rebooked on alternative flights. The ultimatum had been delivered, the choice made, the consequences set in motion. What had begun as a routine flight to Los Angeles had transformed into something none of the passengers would soon forget. A rare glimpse of institutional accountability functioning as it should, of power used to protect rather than to persecute, of justice delivered without delay or deflection. As passengers prepared to deplane, many cast final glances at Zoe and her father, an ordinary teenager and an extraordinary airline captain who had together sparked what would likely become a watershed moment in how airlines handled medical accommodations and addressed discriminatory conduct among staff. The reckoning was complete, but its ripple effects were just beginning. The apology required of Veronica Ellis represented more than just words exchanged between a former flight attendant and a wronged passenger. It marked a fundamental rebalancing of power witnessed by hundreds in person and soon to be viewed by millions online. This wasn't just about one employee's misconduct or one passenger's suffering. It was about accountability in its purest form. As Veronica turned to face Zoe Jackson, the cabin fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of passengers gathering belongings for deplaning ceased as everyone recognized the significance of this final act in the unfolding drama. Zoe Veronica began, her voice breaking. "I am deeply sorry for how I treated you today. I was wrong about your medication, wrong about your medical needs, wrong about everything. What I did was inexcusable, and I hope someday you can forgive me." The words themselves were appropriate, but it was impossible to separate them from the circumstances of their delivery, required rather than volunteered, offered under the watchful eye of Captain Jackson and hundreds of witnesses, delivered by someone whose career had just ended. The sincerity of forced contrition is always questionable, a reality not lost on anyone present. Zoe regarded Veronica for a long moment before responding, her expression thoughtful rather than vindictive. Despite being only 17, despite having just experienced a traumatic medical emergency caused by this woman's prejudice, Zoe exhibited a composure that many adults in the cabin visibly admired. "I accept your apology," she said simply. "I hope you learn from this." The response was remarkable for what it didn't contain. No further humiliation of someone already facing the consequences of their actions. No vindictive satisfaction, no rejection of the apology regardless of its circumstances. Instead, Zoe offered the most valuable response possible: acceptance paired with hope for growth. Captain Jackson nodded slightly, his expression softening momentarily as he observed his daughter's grace under pressure. It was a quality he had cultivated in her since childhood, teaching her that dignity in the face of prejudice was not just a personal choice, but a powerful statement. As Veronica was escorted toward the front of the aircraft by Sofia Martinez's passengers, began to gather their belongings in earnest, the confrontation now resolved, but its impact still reverberating through the cabin. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, many discussing what they had just witnessed. "That girl has more class than most adults I know," one passenger remarked to her seatmate. "Forced apologies don't mean much," another replied skeptically. "It's not about what it means to the flight attendant," a third passenger joined in. "It's about returning dignity to the person who was wronged." Dr. Hernandez, who had remained beside Zoe throughout the ordeal, spoke quietly to her as the deplaning process began. "You handled that with remarkable maturity." "How are you feeling now?" "Physically better," Zoe replied, her voice stronger, though still carrying traces of fatigue from her ordeal. "Emotionally, I'm not sure yet. It all happened so fast." The medical team Captain Jackson had summoned was waiting at the jet bridge, as arrangements were made for Zoe to be evaluated. Before continuing her journey, Isabella Rodriguez approached cautiously, her live stream still active, but her camera now lowered respectfully. "Zoe," she said gently, "I'm Isabella Rodriguez, independent journalist. What you experienced today has already reached hundreds of thousands of viewers. Many are asking how they can support you or learn from this incident. Would you be willing to share any thoughts?" Captain Jackson moved protectively toward his daughter, but Zoe placed a hand on his arm, indicating she wanted to respond. "What happened to me today happens to people all the time," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The difference is that most don't have a father with captain's stripes or hundreds of witnesses with cameras. If there's something people can learn from this, maybe it's to speak up when you see someone being mistreated, especially if, they don't look like they have power or connections." The wisdom in her response beyond her 17 years caused several nearby passengers to nod in agreement. Isabella lowered her camera completely, acknowledging the thoughtfulness of Zoe's statement with professional respect. "Thank you," she said simply. "I wish you a safe journey to Los Angeles." As passengers filed toward the exit, many paused briefly near Zoe's row, offering words of support or simply nods of acknowledgement. What had begun as a terrifying medical emergency had transformed into something approaching a communal experience, a shared witness to injustice addressed to accountability imposed to dignity restored. Near the front of the aircraft, Veronica Ellis waited for the passengers to deplane her company ID, and Wings already surrendered her uniform, now simply clothes rather than a symbol of authority. The tears had stopped, replaced by a vacant expression that suggested she was still processing the seismic shift in her circumstances. In less than an hour, she had gone from confidently exercising authority to facing unemployment, public disgrace, and potential industry-wide blacklisting. As the last passengers deplaned, Captain Jackson approached his daughter once more. "The medical team will check you over, and then we'll make arrangements to get you to Grandma's funeral. I've already spoken to Mom's sister, and she's meeting us at the airport." Zoe nodded, gathering her strength to stand. "Dad, what's going to happen now? With the airline, I mean." Captain Jackson considered the question carefully before responding. What happened today revealed problems that go beyond one flight attendant's poor judgment. There will be investigations, policy reviews, probably changes to training and procedures. But the most important change has already happened. Hundreds of people just witnessed accountability in action. They'll carry that with them, both the crew members and the passengers. As they moved toward the exit, Zoe leaning slightly on her father's arm. They passed Veronica Ellis, still waiting to be escorted to crew operations. For a brief moment, three lives that had collided so dramatically paused in proximity. The former flight attendant, whose career had ended the teenager whose medical emergency had triggered a viral moment, and the airline captain whose dual roles as father and executive had catalyzed accountability. No words were exchanged in that moment. None were needed. The apology had been given and accepted. Justice, imperfect but immediate, had been served. What remained was for each person to move forward. Veronica to face the consequences of her actions, Zoe to complete her journey to her grandmother's funeral, and Captain Jackson to ensure that what happened today led to lasting changes rather than temporary damage control. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, leaving United Airways Flight 829 behind, they entered a world where their story was already spreading across social media platforms, news outlets, and dinner table conversations. A case study in what happens when prejudice meets power, when assumptions meet authority, when wrong meets right in the confined space of an aircraft cabin on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. The apology had ended the confrontation, but its ripple effects were just beginning. As Zoe Jackson sat in a quiet corner of the United Airways Club Lounge, the oxygen monitor still attached to her finger showed steady improvement in her blood oxygen levels. The medical team Captain Jackson had summoned had confirmed what Dr. Hernandez had already assessed. She was recovering well from a severe asthma attack that could have had much more serious consequences without intervention. "Your numbers are looking good," the paramedic said, removing the monitor. "Keep using your inhaler as prescribed for the next 24 hours and follow up with your regular doctor when you return home. You were lucky today." Zoe nodded, though she knew luck had little to do with it. Without Dr. Hernandez's intervention and her father's timely arrival, the outcome could have been drastically different. She glanced across the lounge where Captain Marcus Jackson stood in intense conversation with three executives who had arrived from United's corporate offices within 30 minutes of the incident. Their expressions were grave, their body language conveying the seriousness with which they were treating the situation. The CEO just released an official statement, Isabella Rodriguez said, approaching Zoe's seat with permission from the medical staff. She showed Zoe her phone screen where United's corporate response was displayed. United Airways is aware of an incident on Flight 829 at JFK, involving a medical accommodation issue that was handled inappropriately by a crew member. The crew member in question has been separated from the company effective immediately. We are conducting a thorough investigation and reviewing our training and policies on medical accommodations. We extend our sincere apologies to the affected passenger and all those inconvenienced by this incident. United has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind, and we are taking immediate steps to ensure this type of incident never occurs again. Isabella's live stream had ended, but her reporting continued. "Your story has reached over 2 million viewers in the past hour," she explained. "Major networks are covering it, and United stock has already dropped 3 points in response." Zoe absorbed this information with a maturity beyond her 17 years. "I never wanted to be at the center of a viral moment," she said quietly. "I just wanted to breathe." Isabella nodded sympathetically. "Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we choose, but the ones that choose us. You've handled this with remarkable grace." "What happens to the woman?" Veronica Zoe asked. "Dad mentioned termination, but what does that really mean for her?" Isabella considered her response carefully. "It means she'll likely never work in commercial aviation again. With the video evidence and your father's position, this incident will follow her professionally. It's a career-ending moment." Zoe fell silent, processing this. Despite everything Veronica had put her through, she felt no satisfaction in another person's downfall. That seems harsh. "But I guess when someone's actions could have killed someone—" "Exactly," Isabella replied. "This isn't about punishment, it's about safety. Someone who makes those kinds of judgments shouldn't be responsible for passenger welfare." Across the lounge, the deplaned passengers from Flight 829 were being processed by a team of customer service representatives mobilized specifically for this crisis. The airline's response had been swift and comprehensive. Private car services arranged for first-class passengers, priority rebooking on competitor airlines, when necessary meal vouchers and hotel accommodations for those facing significant delays. We're offering full refunds, plus $1,000 travel vouchers to all passengers, one representative explained to a family being rebooked. United understands the seriousness of what occurred today, and we're committed to making it right. Not all passengers were satisfied with this response. The businessman who had defended airline protocols on the flight was now loudly complaining to a customer service manager. "This is completely unreasonable," he insisted. "An entire flight canceled because one employee made a mistake. I have important meetings in Los Angeles that can't be rescheduled." "Sir, I understand your frustration," the manager replied calmly. "This wasn't just an employee mistake, it was a safety incident that required full investigation. We've arranged priority booking for you on American's flight departing in 1 hour." Dr. Hernandez, who had been invited to the lounge as a gesture of appreciation for his intervention, observed the corporate damage control with professional interest. "They're handling the aftermath well," he remarked to a fellow passenger. "But the real test will be whether they address the underlying issues or just manage the PR crisis." Sofia Martinez moved efficiently through the lounge, personally checking on passengers with special needs or connection concerns. Her role in the incident, her attempt to intervene with Veronica, however belated, had been noted by senior management. Rather than facing scrutiny for not doing more, she had been tasked with leading the customer recovery effort, a tacit acknowledgement that she had tried to do the right thing under difficult circumstances. In a private office adjacent to the lounge, Veronica Ellis sat with a human resources representative and a union official completing the paperwork for her resignation. Her face remained tear-streaked, her hands trembling as she signed the documents that ended her 12-year career with United Airways. "I understand I'll never work in aviation again," she said, her voice hollow. "I accept that. But I need to know, will this follow me everywhere? Will I ever be able to work anywhere again?" The HR representative's response was carefully measured. "Your separation is being processed as a resignation rather than a termination, as Captain Jackson offered you that option. However, the incident has gained significant public attention, which may present challenges for future employment. The company is not planning to take further action against you beyond the separation itself. It was small comfort, but the only comfort available in a situation largely of her own making." Back in the main lounge, Captain Jackson concluded his meeting with the executives and returned to his daughter's side. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his professional demeanor softening as he focused on Zoe's well-being. "Better," she replied. "The paramedics say I'm stable. When can we get to Los Angeles? I don't want to miss Grandma's funeral." Captain Jackson checked his watch. "I've arranged for us to take the next flight departing in 2 hours. We'll be flying first class, your actual assigned seat this time, and I'll be traveling with you. The crew has already been briefed about your medical needs." Zoe nodded, relief visible in her expression. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" "With the airline, I mean. Beyond just firing Ms. Ellis." Captain Jackson considered the question carefully. "The executives I just spoke with have authorized an immediate review of all medical accommodation policies and training procedures. They're establishing a task force to examine how these issues are handled across the airline, and they've asked me to lead it." He paused, choosing his next words deliberately. "What happened to you today revealed problems that go beyond one flight attendant's poor judgment. There are likely similar incidents that went unreported or unaddressed. My job now is to make sure this becomes a catalyst for real change, not just a PR crisis that gets managed and forgotten." Around them, the lounge buzzed with activity as passengers shared their experiences. Media inquiries were managed by corporate communications staff, and the airline's response mechanism continued to address the practical fallout from the grounded flight. But in this quiet corner, a father and daughter were having a more profound conversation about justice, accountability, and the possibility of meaningful change. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Zoe asked the question, reflecting both hope and skepticism born from previous experiences with discrimination. "It already has," Captain Jackson replied, gesturing subtly toward the passengers around them. Everyone on that flight witnessed accountability in action today. They saw what happens when prejudice is confronted directly, rather than managed quietly behind closed doors. That changes people, both those who might face similar treatment and those who might be tempted to exercise authority improperly. Zoe considered this, then nodded slowly. Grandma would have liked that, she said, a small smile touching her lips despite the lingering sadness of her loss. She always said that change happens when someone refuses to accept the unacceptable. Captain Jackson's expression softened at the mention of his mother. She was right. "And today you refuse to accept the unacceptable. I'm proud of you, Zoe." As they prepared to continue their journey to Los Angeles, neither fully realized how far the ripples from Flight 829 would spread, or how many lives would be touched by what had begun as one teenager's fight to breathe on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. 3 years after the incident that transformed her from an anonymous teenager to a symbol of medical rights advocacy, Zoe Jackson stood at a podium in the Department of Transportation's main conference room in Washington, D.C. At 20, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her voice through unexpected circumstances. Today marks the official implementation of the Federal Medical Accommodation Standards Act, she announced to the assembled officials, advocates, and media representatives. This legislation ensures that every person traveling on any commercial transportation system in the United States has the right to access their necessary medical devices and medications without question or delay. The journey from viral incident to federal legislation had been neither quick nor easy. It had required sustained advocacy, coalition building, and countless hours of testimony before regulatory bodies and congressional committees. But the result, comprehensive protection for travelers with medical needs, represented a fundamental shift in how transportation systems approached passenger welfare. After the ceremony, Zoe found a quiet moment with her father, now United Airways' Executive Vice President of Passenger Experience. Their relationship had evolved in the years since the incident, strengthened by their shared commitment to transforming a personal crisis into institutional change. "Grandma would be proud," Zoe said softly, touching the small photo she carried in her wallet, her grandmother Eliza, whose funeral she had been traveling to when the incident occurred. "She would." Captain Jackson agreed. "Not just of the policy changes, but of how you've handled everything with dignity, purpose, and without losing yourself in the process." As they prepared to leave, Zoe noticed a familiar face across the room, Dr. Rafael Hernandez, now 78, but still active as the chair of the Medical Accommodation Advisory Board. The physician whose intervention had been crucial during her asthma attack had become a respected ally in the campaign for reform. "You know," Dr. Hernandez said as he joined them in 45 years of medicine, "I've seen many policies change, but rarely with the speed and substance of what you two have accomplished. Most reforms come after lengthy studies and incremental adjustments. You managed to transform an entire approach to passenger medical needs within 3 years." What Dr. Hernandez didn't say, what didn't need saying among the three of them, was that the changes had likely saved lives. Passengers who might once have hidden medical conditions for fear of confrontation or skepticism now registered them confidently. Crew members who might once have questioned the legitimacy of medical needs now followed clear protocols for verification and accommodation. The result was a transportation system where medical emergencies were less frequent and more effectively addressed when they did occur. The legislative victory represented the culmination of efforts that had begun in the confined space of an aircraft cabin 3 years earlier, but Zoe knew that her work wasn't finished. as a biomedical engineering student specializing in accessible medical devices. She was developing technologies that would further reduce barriers for individuals with chronic conditions. "What's next?" a reporter asked as Zoe prepared to leave the ceremony. "After achieving federal legislation, where do you focus your advocacy efforts?" Zoe considered the question carefully before responding. "The legislation creates a framework, but the real work happens in implementation, in training transportation staff, educating passengers about their rights, and ensuring that these protections extend to everyone, not just those with the resources or knowledge to advocate for themselves." She paused, then added a reflection that captured the essence of what she had learned through her unexpected journey from passenger to advocate. "What happened to me was exceptional, only because it was documented and addressed. For every incident that goes viral, hundreds more occur without witnesses or accountability. Real change means building systems where justice doesn't depend on having a father with captain stripes or a viral video to prove your experience." As Zoe and her father left the Department of Transportation, they passed a group of young transportation management trainees, being instructed on the new federal standards. The instructor was using Zoe's experience as a case study in how not to approach passenger medical needs and how proper accommodation could prevent potentially fatal outcomes. It was a small moment, but it represented the lasting impact of what had begun as 18 minutes of discrimination and danger on United Airways Flight 829. The incident had been transformed from a personal trauma into an institutional lesson, from a viral moment into lasting reform, from one teenager's fight to breathe into protection for millions of passengers who would never know her name, but would benefit from the changes her experience had catalyzed. Zoe Jackson had boarded that flight as a grieving granddaughter traveling to a funeral. She had emerged as an advocate whose experience would reshape how transportation systems approached passenger medical needs for generations to come. In the process, she had discovered something her grandmother had always tried to teach her, that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not simply to overcome it personally, but to ensure that others never have to face it at all. And that perhaps was the most meaningful resolution to a story that began with a simple plea: "Please, I can't breathe without it." These real-life stories remind us that one person's courage can create meaningful change. Zoe's touching story proves that advocacy matters, that young voices can transform industries, and that dignity in the face of discrimination is a powerful force. Have you witnessed or experienced discrimination that needed to be documented? Share your experiences in the comments below. Stories like Zoe's show us that individual actions can lead to lasting change. Hit subscribe to see more stories of people fighting injustice with intelligence and courage, and share this video to spread awareness about the power of accountability in creating social change.